It began in the thawing mud of a dying winter, in a land of broken armies and desperate dreams. It was March 1945, and the Third Reich was collapsing from within. Cities lay in ruins, its armies shattered, its skies filled with the relentless hum of Allied bombers. Yet even as the noose tightened, Adolf Hitler refused to surrender to reality. In his mind, there was still one last card to play, one final strike that might change everything. Deep in Hungary, where the last drops of oil still flowed from the earth, he ordered the impossible, a counterattack, massive and glorious, to reclaim the initiative and restore faith in a lost cause. It would be called Operation Spring Awakening, Frühlingserwachen, a name heavy with irony, for it was not a new beginning, but the final gasp of a dying empire. This is the entire history of Operation Spring Awakening, Hitler's last Panzer offensive, a battle fought in mud, blood and delusion, where valor and futility collided beneath the melting snows of the Eastern Front. To understand the madness of Spring Awakening, we must return to the shattered heart of the Reich in early 1945. The Red Army was everywhere, from the Baltic to the Carpathians, pressing in on every front. Berlin itself was less than 200 miles from the advancing Soviets. Yet Hitler's gaze turned south, toward Hungary, a land of oil fields and bitter importance. There, the last reserves of petroleum, feeding the German war machine, lay around Lake Balaton, a glittering stretch of water in a countryside now frozen in fear. To lose those oil fields meant the end of movement, the end of tanks, the end of hope. Hitler believed that if his elite SS Panzer divisions could launch one final offensive, drive back the Soviets, and secure the oil, he could buy time, weeks, perhaps months, to rebuild, to regroup, to bargain. It was a delusion dressed as strategy, but one the German High Command dared not defy. The task fell to Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, recently withdrawn from the Ardennes after the failure of the Battle of the Bulge. Hardened veterans of Normandy and the Western Front, they were among the finest armoured forces Germany still possessed, but they were exhausted, under-equipped, and facing an enemy that had grown unstoppable. Alongside them, Hermann Belk's 6th Army and the 2nd Panzer Army prepared to strike across the Hungarian plains. Facing them was Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front of the Red Army, dug in, fortified, and fully aware that the Germans were planning something. The Soviet lines were deep and flexible, their supplies endless, their morale high. The Germans, by contrast, were fighting on fumes. Their tanks ran on borrowed fuel. Their soldiers shivered in the slush. Yet still the order came. On March 6, 1945, under a pale and bitter dawn, the Panzers moved. The earth was soft, the air thick with mist, and the roads almost impassable. What began as a thunderous assault quickly sank into a mire of mud and confusion. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions advanced through knee-deep slush, their treads clogged, their engines roaring in protest. The fields of Hungary swallowed steel and men alike. Still the offensive pressed forward. Columns of panthers and tigers clawed their way toward the Danube, aiming to cut off the Soviet spearheads and relieve Budapest, which had already fallen weeks earlier after a brutal siege. For a moment it worked. The German armor drove wedges through the Soviet lines, capturing villages and forcing retreats. The Red Army reeled, but only briefly. By the second day, the Soviet counterattack began. Zhukov and Tolbukhin's forces responded with overwhelming firepower. Artillery and Katyusha rockets rained down on the bogged German armor. Soviet T-34 Ss appeared like ghosts from the smoke, firing point-blank through the fog. The Germans, lacking air cover and ammunition, were forced to fight on the ground they could no longer move across. The mighty panzers became stationary fortresses, monuments of defiance, and tombs in waiting. The melting snow turned the plains into a graveyard of machinery. Crews abandoned tanks that sank into the mud, their engines drowned, their treads frozen. The offensive, meant to strike with lightning speed, had slowed to a crawl. And still, the orders from Berlin were clear: advance at all costs. Hitler believed victory was near. He accused his commanders of cowardice, of betrayal, of lacking faith in destiny. But the truth was undeniable. The Soviets had outnumbered them 10-1. The Red Army's tanks rolled with endless reserves, their guns firing day and night. By March 10th, the offensive had stalled completely. The German lines were stretched thin, their flanks exposed. Tolboteng counterattacked with his 4th Guards Army and 26th Army, striking south and west, trapping the German spearheads in the swamps and forests near Lake Balaton. The once proud SS divisions, symbols of the Reich's fury and pride, found themselves fighting to survive, their dreams of victory drowned in the same mud that caked their treads. By mid-March, the German retreat had begun. The panzers fell back through villages they had taken days before, leaving behind wreckage, corpses, and the smouldering shells of tanks. Soviet troops advanced relentlessly, capturing the Sárvíz Canal, pushing the Germans toward Austria. The offensive that was supposed to save Hungary had instead doomed it. Within weeks, Vienna would fall. The oil fields were lost. The last reserves of fuel burned away in the engines of tanks that would never return. On March 15th, Hitler ordered Sepp Dietrich's SS divisions to hold their ground to the last man. Dietrich, disgusted and disillusioned, withdrew his forces in defiance. When Hitler learned of it, he erupted in fury, accusing the Waffen SS of treason, the final crack in a relationship once built on fanatic loyalty. Operation Spring Awakening was over. In less than 2 weeks, the last great German offensive had crumbled. More than 12,000 German soldiers were dead or missing. Hundreds of tanks lay abandoned in the Hungarian mud. The Soviets, though bloodied, stood triumphant. Their road to Vienna and to Berlin was now open. The defeat was total, the delusion complete. It was the final act of a military machine that no longer existed, commanded by a man who no longer understood the world around him. The panzers that once conquered Europe were now ghosts, their tracks ending in the fields of Hungary. For the men who fought there, Spring Awakening was a nightmare. A battle fought not for victory, but for pride. German veterans would later describe it as the most senseless offensive of the war, a final gesture from a regime drowning in its own madness. The Red Army soldiers, hardened by years of blood and loss, saw it differently, as proof that even cornered, the enemy still had claws, and that only total destruction could end the nightmare. Within a month, they would be fighting in the streets of Berlin itself. Today, the fields around Lake Balaton are peaceful again. The mud that once swallowed tanks now grows wild flowers. The villages that burned have been rebuilt. The lake reflects the sky, as if the war never happened. But beneath the soil, the relics remain: rusted tracks, twisted steel, and bones buried in the earth. The ghosts of Spring Awakening still lie there, silent witnesses to the folly of power and the final breath of a dying empire. Operation Spring Awakening was not a beginning, but an ending, the death rattle of a regime that mistook willpower for strategy and faith for fuel. It was the moment when even the most loyal soldiers realized the truth: the Reich was finished. The last offensive had been launched, not with hope, but with denial, and when it ended, there was nothing left to awaken, only silence. Tonight we return to those flooded plains, to the rumble of engines in the mist, to the cries of men sinking into the mud of history, and to the last flicker of fire from a war that refused to die. This is the entire history of Operation Spring Awakening, Hitler's final Panzer offensive, the last illusion of victory, and the moment when the Third Reich's dream finally drowned beneath its own weight. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you listening beneath quiet skies, far from the echoes of war, or imagining the sound of engines lost in fog as the Empire took its final breath? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. January the 10th, 1945, Reich Chancellery, Berlin. The map room smelled of damp wool, cold tobacco, and stale coffee as Adolf Hitler leaned over a sprawling wall chart marked Oberkommando des Heeres Lag Ost. October 1st, 45. Red Soviet arrows pressed from the Vistula toward the Oder, from Budapest toward Vienna. The wax pencils in General Alfred Jodel's hand trembled slightly as he updated casualty figures. Over 2 million German soldiers lost between January and February alone. Outside, the snow along Wilhelmstrasse had turned to black slush, a frozen graveyard of uniforms and burned-out vehicles. Every day, the courier from OKW brought reports from Hungary, where Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's replacement, General Otto Weller, warned that the oil fields at Nagy Kanisa, the Reich's last functioning source of petroleum, were within range of Soviet artillery. Hitler's silence filled the room more heavily than his words. He traced a finger along Lake Balaton, muttering the phrase Frühlingserwachen, spring awakening. The officers present knew what it meant. Another offensive, another miracle. But the winter outside had no mercy left to give. Germany's armies now ran on fumes and delusion. By that January, the Reich's domestic oil production could supply less than 20% of the Wehrmacht's daily requirements. The rest, nearly 80%, came from Hungary's Nagy Kanisa and Zala oil fields, their derricks still pumping through the snow, guarded by SS engineers from the Totenkopf division. Soviet aerial reconnaissance from the 16th Air Army had already photographed storage tanks near Szombathely and Pécs, identifying them as priority bombing targets. Fuel convoys that once took 12 hours from the Danube refineries to Vienna now took 3 days, their tankers crawling at night without headlights. A single Tiger II burned nearly 500 liters of fuel for every 100 kilometers. A Panzer IV, half that. As the supply trains slowed, divisions that looked powerful on paper existed only as symbols, machines without breath. The numbers weren't just bad, they were terminal. Hitler's generals knew it. He refused to listen. Across the lines, the Red Army measured its advance not in kilometers, but in rivers crossed. Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front pushed north through western Hungary. Its spearheads the 4th Guards Army and the 6th Guards Tank Army, supported by the 37th Air Army, where the Germans moved with dwindling fuel and winter-worn engines. The Soviets moved with momentum and petroleum from Baku. A single T-34-85 tank consumed less than a third of the fuel of a Tiger, yet outnumbered the German heavy tanks 10-1. Soviet logistics were brutal in simplicity. Railheads extended forward, repaired by civilian labor and prisoners, their supplies carried by Studebaker trucks, delivered through the Persian corridor. German railway timetables, by contrast, read like necrologies. Entire lines marked zerstört, destroyed by Allied bombers. The contrast was more than material, it was philosophical. One system embraced redundancy, the other perfection. In war, perfection dies first. By mid-January, reports from Führerbunker painted a picture so desperate it bordered on the absurd. Field Marshal Otto Wöhler telegraphed Berlin on the 12th. If the oil fields fall, the Reich cannot move a single tank. Attached were lost charts showing daily fuel issues per Panzer division. SS Totenkopf received less than 20 tons, while normal combat operation required 70. Hitler ordered the figures rewritten. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels' diary entry of January 16th captured the mood. The Führer is convinced the enemy will break before spring. He believes in an offensive that will stun the world. The phrase spread through the bunker corridors like a rumor of salvation. In reality, the tanks earmarked for this miracle stood cold on sidings near Vienna, their engines cannibalized for parts. Mechanics ran drills without fuel, pretending the smell of kerosene. Each day the winter pressed harder. Each night Berlin froze deeper into denial. The Hungarian plains offered no comfort. Temperatures sank below -20 degrees Celsius, turning the Danube into a glittering artery of ice. Soviet pontoon units tested its thickness daily, while German engineers blew charges to shatter crossings. In aerial photographs from the Luftwaffe's 4Rs/41 reconnaissance Staffel, the Danube appears as a white scar dotted with the wrecks of barges, Germany's last oil lifeline. Without it, the synthetic plants at Luna and Politz starved of crude. Railway dispatches from Nagorno to Vienna in late January showed an average delay of 72 hours. 1 in 5 trains never arrived. The numbers turned abstract until you realized each missing tanker meant another panzer immobilized, another unit stranded, another village burned to delay the inevitable. Oil had become the bloodline of the Reich, and Hungary its last beating heart. The Soviets were reaching for the knife. Hitler's obsession with offensive action defied the arithmetic of reality. He pointed to the Ardennes, December 1944, as proof that surprise could still reverse fate. The West hesitated, he argued. So will the East. But where the Ardennes had concentrated over 2,000 tanks and 500,000 men, Frühlingserwachen would begin with barely a third of that strength. SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, refitted after its failure in Belgium, received the order to transfer east on January 18th. Soldiers cursed as they loaded their Panthers onto trains bound for Hungary, leaving the Western Front exposed. The irony was cruel. The Reich stripping its defences to defend oil that could no longer fuel the very tanks it sent. British intelligence, decrypting Enigma traffic at Bletchley Park, noted this in a ULTRA report dated January 20th. German redeployments indicate renewed commitment to the Hungarian theatre, despite unsustainable fuel reserves. Even their enemies recognized the madness. Among the few who still believed was Hitler himself. Witnesses recalled him in the map room at 3 in the morning, pacing in slippers, tracing the Balaton lakeshore with shaking fingers. Here, he whispered, we strike here, and the Soviets will collapse. The logic was detached from the world outside. The Reichstag dome blackened, Berliners queuing for horse meat, and refugee trains stretching west. The Reich's high command clung to fantasies, not of victory, but of motion, of anything that still suggested control. In personal notes, General Heinz Guderian wrote simply, "The Führer lives in another universe." Yet within that universe, orders carried the weight of command, and faith fused into one. Hitler's staff prepared maps, timetables, fuel ration charts, as if numbers could conjure armies. It was the bureaucracy of belief, and belief in that frozen winter was all that remained. By the end of January, the outcome was inevitable, though few dared to say it aloud. The Reich's final reserves of armor and manpower converged toward Hungary for an offensive the world would later call Operation Spring Awakening. In the snow-choked rail yards of Vienna, tank crews huddled beside their vehicles, writing home under the orange glow of signal lamps. They did not know this would be the last great armored offensive Germany would ever mount. Above them, the sky remained blank and merciless, the breath of men freezing in mid-air. The Soviet artillery thundered closer with each passing day, shaking the ground like a warning. The dream of turning the tide had become a ritual of postponement. Beneath the winter that would not end, a nation prepared to burn its last oil for a vision already gone. The next chapter would begin where hope met ice, on the plains of Hungary, under the cold sun of March. February the 3rd, 1945, Reich Chancellery Bunker, Berlin. The air was heavy with coal dust and damp paper as Adolf Hitler dictated to General Alfred Jodl, his right hand gripping the edge of the map table until his knuckles whitened. The map before him showed the Balaton region of western Hungary, Lake Balaton itself, a grey-blue smear of thawing ice, the surrounding terrain marked with the penciled label Schlamm Zone, Mud Zone. The operation's code name, Frühlingserwachen, was written in black ink across the Danube bend, like a signature of defiance. Hitler's orders, entered into OKW file, Weisung Anna 11, were explicit. The 6th SS Panzer Army will strike from the area of Veszprém toward Stuhlweissenberg, secure the oil region of Nagykanisa, and protect Vienna from the south. It sounded, on paper, like the revival of Blitzkrieg, but around the table, the faces of Jodl, Guderian, and Keitel betrayed a truth no one dared speak aloud. The Reich had no fuel, no reserves, and no time. The only resource still abundant was belief. The Weisung Nero 11 briefing outlined 3 converging axes of attack: 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, 6th Army under General Hermann Balck, and 3rd Hungarian Army under General Joseph Hessler-Nie. Combined they numbered barely 270,000 men and 1,200 armored vehicles, many of them in need of overhaul. By comparison, the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front opposite them fielded over 500,000 troops, 2,000 tanks, and near-total air superiority. Hitler's staff tried to disguise the imbalance by emphasizing quality over quantity. Panther Os, G and Tiger II heavy tanks from SS Panzer divisions, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Hohenstaufen. On the map, the arrows looked bold. In reality, the distances were punishing 40 kilometers of swamp, marsh and thawing farmland, separating the assembly areas near Székesfehérvár from the Soviet lines. Hitler's obsession with seizing the oil fields gave the plan its direction, but not its logic. Guderian, reviewing the terrain analysis from Abteilung Fremde Heer Ost, noted dryly, "The Führer chooses to attack where tanks cannot move." The room stayed silent. No one contradicted him. The technical problem was simple and deadly. The region around Lake Balaton was entering the Rasputisa, the spring thaw that turned every track into a mire of liquid clay. In early February, Wehrmacht engineers measured ground-bearing capacity at less than 1/10 normal levels, barely enough to support a wheeled truck, let alone a 70-ton Tiger II. Soviet intelligence had reached the same conclusion. Their planners assumed no major offensive could occur before April, where German panzer tactics relied on speed and maneuver, coordinated thrusts of armor and mechanized infantry. The Red Army favored depth and resilience. They could lose terrain and still counterattack within hours using mobile artillery reserves. To Hitler, that distinction meant nothing. He viewed terrain as moral, not mechanical. The SS will overcome mud as it has overcome the Bolsheviks, he told Dietrich. But mud is no ideology, it swallows everything equally. Inside OKW headquarters, the daily situation conferences turned into rituals of self-hypnosis. Hitler would summon Sepp Dietrich and General Bulk, demanding exact timetables when the lead elements of Leibstandarte would reach the Sárvíz Canal, when bridging equipment could cross the Sárvíz marsh. Each answer required a fiction. The 6th SS Panzer Army possessed only 50% of its authorized fuel, according to a report from Wirtschafts- und Rüstungsamt dated February 10th. Supply columns from Vienna carried barrels of aviation fuel repurposed for tanks, despite the damage it caused to Maybach HL 230 engines. Mechanics described engines seizing after 20 kilometers, their lubricants thick as syrup in sub-zero air. Still, Hitler ordered no delay. His logic followed a political rhythm, not a logistical one. Victory near Lake Balaton would prove to the world and to the wavering Hungarians that the Reich still commanded destiny. Strategy had become theater, and the stage was collapsing. The illusion of control extended down to the smallest details. Hitler personally dictated the camouflage patterns for SS tanks, whitewash over dark yellow, to confuse Soviet reconnaissance. He rejected General Guderian's proposal to shorten the attack frontage to preserve fuel, declaring the Red Army must be struck everywhere, not in pieces. In practical terms, this decision stretched 6th Panzer Army's 16 divisions across a frontage of nearly 80 kilometers, diluting their striking power. The Soviet defense sectors, by contrast, concentrated 3 lines of anti-tank belts, reinforced with Katyusha rocket batteries and minefields, up to 5 kilometers deep. Operational analysis by OKH General Quartiermeister later called it the most unfavorable terrain and disposition conceivable for armored warfare. But to Hitler, numbers were abstractions. His maps had grown symbolic, thick arrows sweeping eastward as though gesture alone could conjure strength. The thicker the pencil line, the greater the illusion of might. Dietrich's meeting with Hitler on February 16th captured the chasm between battlefield and bunker. The former Waffen-SS cavalryman stood rigid as Hitler outlined the plan again, stabbing at the map with his pencil. "The enemy will not expect a winter attack," Hitler declared. "It will be blitzkrieg reborn." Dietrich, by then hardened by Ardennes' failure, merely nodded. He knew his divisions were exhausted, many still re-equipping from Belgium. Tank readiness reports from SS Das Reich listed operational strength at 42%, Hohenstaufen at barely 38%. Ammunition trains delayed by Allied bombing arrived half-empty, forcing units to ration shells. The 6th Army to their left fielded Volksgrenadier divisions filled with untrained conscripts. Even with this knowledge, Dietrich's salute was sharp. Loyalty had replaced logic, and the Reich's last great offensive was being written by faith against fact. The human machinery, beneath the grand strategy, bore the cost of those illusions. In the map rooms, young officers from Heeresgruppe Süd worked through the night plotting supply lines that no longer existed. Drafting pencils snapped under pressure as rail schedules failed to align with fuel allocations. Radio operators in Budapest relayed Soviet air reconnaissance warnings that went unheeded. One staff officer, Major Gerhard Engel, later recalled, "It was as if we were designing an attack on the moon, perfect on paper, impossible in reality. Even the weather seemed complicit." A sudden thaw on February 24th flooded entire tank routes near Vapalota, submerging trucks to their axles. Still, The orders continued to flow from Berlin. Angriffstermin bleibt unverändert. Attack date unchanged. To disobey was unthinkable. To obey was ruin. By the final week of February, the planning maps at OKW glowed with false confidence. Arrows, unit symbols, and fuel tallies written in green ink. Operation Frühlingserwachen would commence in early March. Its purpose stated plainly: protect the oil fields, defend Vienna, and restore faith. But behind the rhetoric lay exhaustion. Even the teleprinters clattered slower as paper ran short and ink froze in their ribbons. Hitler's staff sealed the orders under file number OKW/OP/Feb.27/45, and the trains began to roll east once more. The 6th SS Panzer Army moved toward its fate, engines coughing through the cold as mechanics whispered prayers over steel. In the bunkers of Berlin, the maps glowed under candlelight, a geometry of hope drawn against arithmetic defeat. The plan was complete. The illusion was perfect, and as the snow began to melt across Hungary, the ground itself prepared to betray it. Early March 1945, Veszprém rail junction, Western Hungary. The first train carrying the remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, screeched to a halt beneath grey skies and drifting snow. The wagons were not filled with soldiers singing or confident tank crews, but with frost-bitten men and crippled machines lashed together by wire and exhaustion. Oil leaked from frozen gaskets, and steel plates bore the stains of Ardennes mud still clinging from the winter offensive, barely 3 months earlier. In the lead flat car stood a Panzer Kampfwagen V Panther, serial number 70339, its gun locked in traverse, its engine lifeless since December. Major Max Hansen noted in his field log that 50% of vehicles arrived unfit for combat. The air reeked of cold diesel and defeat. Men who once rolled through France in triumph now limped eastward to face the Red Army. It was not a deployment, it was a retreat in disguise. By official report of March 5, 1945, the 6th SS Panzer Army could field only 60% of its authorized strength. Out of more than 800 tanks and assault guns on paper, barely 300 could move under their own power. Fuel reserves, measured in cubic meters, were less than 1/10 of what Guderian's logistics staff had requested for sustained operations. Lubricants had thickened into tar during the winter cold, and spare parts existed more as wishes than as inventory. Technicians cannibalized wrecks by lantern light, pulling starters and transmissions from tanks still marked with Ardennes snow camouflage. The repair depots near Gura resembled graveyards more than workshops. Guderian's war diary for March 11th noted bitterly, "The 6th SS Army arrives not as an instrument of victory, but as a patient in need of resuscitation." The paper strength fooled Berlin. The engines did not. What had once been the armoured spearhead of the Reich now rolled on borrowed time. 3 months earlier in the Ardennes, the same formations had thundered into Belgium with more than 1,000 tanks and the full arrogance of experience. Now the contrast was mathematical cruelty. At the start of the December offensive, the 1st SS Panzer Division had fielded 93 Panthers, 74 Panzer IVs, and 42 assault guns. By the time they reached Hungary, barely 40 machines remained operational, half of them running on scavenged fuel from abandoned Wehrmacht trucks. The comparison was not only mechanical, but psychological. In the Ardennes, morale had fed on surprise and the illusion of a turning tide. In Hungary, it collapsed under the weight of fuel reports and frostbite charts. Even their field rations told the story. Once daily hot meals had shrunk to cold barley soup and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns. The army that Hitler called elite now resembled a collection of ghosts dragging their own reputations through the snow. Among these ghosts marched the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. Their average age was 18, their training steeped in propaganda rather than logistics. Private Dieter Engel's letter home, dated March 7th, described his squad's condition: "We share 3 pairs of gloves among 8 men. Our tank is named Hild, but has not moved since Cologne." Field reports confirmed his reality. Half the division's Panthers lacked track pins, and batteries had frozen solid in the sub-zero nights. Engineers attempted to jump-start vehicles using truck engines, often destroying electrical systems in the process. The division's commander, SS Brigadeführer Hugo Kraus, requested motor oil by the barrel. He received promises by the paragraph. Fanaticism could make men march, but it could not make machinery move. When the order came to prepare for Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, the irony was not lost on the men. Spring was nowhere in sight. From Berlin, the High Command still spoke the language of precision and victory. Maps in the Führerbunker showed thick blue arrows sweeping toward the Danube, as if ink could replace gasoline. Hitler's confidence in the 6th SS Panzer Army bordered on delusion. He referred to it as his steel wall, ignoring reports that most divisions were fighting at company strength. Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, tried to interject realism. His diary entries from March 12 note a confrontation in which he told Hitler directly, "You expect miracles from men who have neither fuel nor rest." Hitler dismissed him with a single phrase: "Faith moves mountains." Faith, however, could not move Panthers with empty fuel tanks. The gulf between command theory and field reality was now lethal. Each kilometer eastward consumed the last fragments of Germany's mechanized power. Technically, the deficiencies were crippling. The Maybach HL 230 engines that powered the Panther required meticulous oil maintenance. Without it, bearings seized within hours. By contrast, the Soviet T-34's diesel V2 engine could run under abuse that would destroy any German design. Soviet fuel lines were thicker, their lubricants adapted to sub-zero conditions. German crews fought mechanical entropy as fiercely as they fought the enemy. Even the simplest consumables, spark plugs, gaskets, and belts, were scavenged from destroyed vehicles, often cut and repurposed by hand. In post-war assessments by the U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Report No. 34, it was concluded that German armored divisions in Hungary suffered greater losses to mechanical failure than to Soviet fire. The machines had become liabilities, and the men their unwilling mechanics. When the engines died, morale followed. The psychological erosion was evident in every letter, every field report. Obersturmführer Karl-Heinz Mertens wrote to his wife, "We used to fight for victory. Now we fight to avoid humiliation." Units marched without insignia to hide their identity from locals who greeted them with silence rather than admiration. Even the SS runes, once symbols of pride, were covered in mud and despair. Soldiers scavenged firewood from destroyed homes, burning furniture to warm their tents. Reports from the 12th SS medical officer recorded over 200 cases of frostbite in a single week. Alcohol rations, meant to boost morale, were replaced by diluted industrial ethanol. What remained of the Panzer Army was an organism kept alive only by inertia. The fanatical oaths of loyalty still echoed, but they rang hollow against the roar of Soviet artillery to the east. The human cost of Hitler's delusion was measured not in ideology, but in exhaustion. As the sun set on March 15, 1945, near Lake Balaton, the officers of the 6th SS Panzer Army gathered for a briefing in a half-collapsed barn. The map spread before them was damp with melted snow, its edges torn from use. The plan for Operation Frühlingserwachen demanded an offensive capacity they no longer possessed. Guderian's reports lay unopened beside the field stove. Outside, soldiers cleaned rifles they would soon abandon for lack of ammunition. A Panzer's turret groaned as it tried to turn. Gears stripped, hydraulics frozen. The sound was more ghostly than martial. Under the flicker of a lantern, one officer whispered, "We were lions once." No one replied. The ghosts of Ardennes had arrived in Hungary, and even the most faithful now understood, belief could not rebuild an army. The stage was set for catastrophe, and the Red Army was already moving to meet them. March the 1st, 1945, reconnaissance airfield near Szolnok, Hungary. A Polikarpov Po-2 biplane, tail number 4783, lifted from the snow-crusted runway, its pilot navigating low over the frozen edges of Lake Balaton. Below, the water shimmered grey-blue, and the surrounding marshland squelched under the thin ice. Reconnaissance cameras clicked in steady rhythm, capturing every tank silhouette, every column of trucks, and every rail siding that carried remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army from Veszprém and Győr. Lieutenant Ivan Petrovich, watching the images develop in the field lab, marked Panther tanks from the 1st SS Leibstandarte and frozen transport vehicles. Each photograph was a confirmation. The Germans were moving east, predictable and exposed. Above the hum of the engines, Petrovich whispered into his notebook, "They do not hide, we wait." These images, combined with intercepted radio traffic, formed the first strands of the Red Web. By March 4th, intercept operators at 3rd Ukrainian Front Headquarters in Uzhhorod had decoded 35 messages from the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht signals networks. These included transmission call signs of panzer units, fuel convoy schedules, and movement orders for battalions of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division. Signals analysts noted timing patterns: trains arrived late, armored units lacked adequate fuel, and messages were repeated as if commanders doubted their own instructions. Technical analysis confirmed that the German shortwave ciphers had been weakened by procedural errors. Field officers frequently reused keys for multiple days. Comparison with intercepts from the Ardennes in December revealed a pattern. The Wehrmacht was once again predictable, relying on mechanical and procedural habits that Soviet intelligence could exploit. The decoded traffic, stored in Tisamo archive file f.227, op.1352, provided confirmation that Hitler's forces were vulnerable before even reaching the front. The Red Army's preparations emphasized both concealment and deception. Anti-tank ditches, some 5 meters wide and 2 meters deep, were cut along the southern flank near Sárvíz marshes, while minefields totaling nearly 12 kilometers were laid in staggered patterns. Soviet rifle divisions, 27 in total, were spread across the defensive line, backed by 400 T-34 and IS-2 tanks concealed in forests and depressions. Unlike German formations, which relied on precise coordination and high-speed maneuvers, Soviet doctrine emphasized redundancy, multiple firing positions, layered defenses, and mobile counterattack units capable of rapid redeployment. Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Orlov, assigned to the reconnaissance unit, observed in his report that the Germans would be forced into kill zones where artillery could be concentrated. Mechanically and tactically, the Wehrmacht was at a disadvantage. The terrain itself was a weapon in Soviet hands. Every mud patch and frozen ditch amplified the disparity. On March 7th, Tolbukin briefed Stalin in the Kremlin via secure teleprinter. "They are coming again," he said, circling Székesfehérvár and Veszprém on the map with a lead pencil. He detailed the German force composition, noting that the 6th SS Panzer Army fielded barely 300 operational tanks and a limited number of self-propelled artillery. By contrast, the Soviets could mass 5 rifle divisions with 80 tanks within 15 kilometers of the anticipated breakthrough points. Reports from reconnaissance flights confirmed assembly points for fuel-depleted Panther and Tiger tanks, while Soviet aerial photography documented gaps in anti-aircraft coverage along the rail lines. Tolbukin stressed that Soviet deception operations, including dummy tank emplacements and staged motor movements, had convinced German planners that resistance would be minimal. Field tests had proven this tactic effective during the Budapest campaign of February. The Red Web was now a combination of intelligence, preparation, and anticipation, waiting for the German advance to thread itself through a trap. Reconnaissance data highlighted logistical weaknesses with deadly precision. Units arriving from Veszprém had averaged only 12 kilometers per day due to frost and mud, with reports indicating broken tracks on 18 Panthers and 12 Tigers en route. Ammunition shortages meant that many battalions carried only 50% of their authorized rounds. Soviet field engineers compared these metrics with German offensive doctrine. Blitzkrieg relied on continuous supply to maintain momentum, yet reports indicated supply trains arriving irregularly, often delayed by destroyed bridges or frozen canals. The implications were clear. Any German push toward Nagykanizsa would stall at natural choke points, exposing tanks to concentrated artillery fire. Soviet planners calculated that the Wehrmacht could lose up to 35% of its armored strength before achieving even minimal objectives. The Red Web had transformed prediction into inevitability. Further intelligence revealed German morale was as brittle as machinery. Intercepted letters from officers and soldiers described exhaustion, frostbite, and lack of confidence in command decisions. Even elite SS divisions, noted for fanaticism, displayed hesitancy in communications. Cryptanalysis captured unusually cautious phrasing. Soviet intelligence officers cross-referenced these human factors with mechanical readiness, determining that the Wehrmacht's operational tempo could not be sustained past the first 3 days of the offensive. Comparisons with reports from the Ardennes offensive showed a consistent trend. Enthusiasm and ideology could not compensate for logistical collapse. Field notes from March 8th, recorded in T-SAMO F.227, Op.1352, D65, confirmed that the Germans were walking into layered defenses prepared to exploit both human and mechanical vulnerabilities. The human dimension of the Red Web was equally precise. Rickentrues noted German officers inspecting damaged vehicles in freezing drizzle, engineers scurrying along muddy roads, and soldiers dragging frozen artillery shells from rail cars. Soviet observers concluded that fatigue, cold, and mechanical attrition had reduced combat effectiveness to roughly 40% of theoretical strength. The disparity between Soviet preparation and German execution created a psychological trap. The Germans believed in mobility and surprise, but every reconnaissance flight and radio intercept fed a different story. Red Army units positioned themselves to observe, report, and adjust dynamically as the Wehrmacht approached. The operational consequence was simple. Hitler's final offensive could be anticipated, funneled, and countered before it fully unfolded. By March 9th, 1945, the contours of the battlefield were clear to Soviet planners. Reconnaissance photographs, radio intercepts, and frontline observations were woven together like threads of a web, a network of information ready to tighten around the advancing Germans. From headquarters in Budapest to artillery batteries along the Sárvíz, every unit knew its role. Hitler's offensive, conceived in Berlin as a hammer to strike Vienna and reclaim oil, would instead stumble through prepared traps. The Soviets waited patiently, their forces ready to spring forward as soon as German units entered the marshy kill zones. Stalin's staff, Watching the updates arrive in sequence allowed a grim satisfaction. The Red Army's preparation had transformed German ambition into predictability. The Red Web was complete, the trap was set, and the Reich's last gamble was approaching the first checkmate. March the 6th, 1945, northeast bank of the Sárvíz marshes, Hungary. Tiger Turka No. 12345, crewed by Unteroffizier Friedrich Meinhardt and his 4 men, strained against the thawing mud as the first rays of dawn cut through a low grey cloud cover. Tracks churned into the marsh, sinking up to 60 centimeters in waterlogged soil. The roar of the Maybach HL 230 engine seemed almost futile against nature itself, and the weight of the tank, 69 tons, threatened the makeshift wooden causeways laid by engineers in a desperate attempt to cross the soft ground. Nearby, an assault gun from the 1st SS Panzer Division sank halfway to its axles, forcing crews to abandon the chassis while dragging the main gun free. Communications crackled intermittently, the SS Signal Corps struggling to maintain contact across divisions scattered by mud and frozen terrain. Meinhardt scribbled in his log, noting fuel consumption higher than predicted for only a few kilometers of movement. The battlefield was no longer a contest of firepower, it was a test of endurance and engineering. The Tiger II's engine required 500 liters of high-octane fuel and precise lubrication to operate under optimal conditions. Any deviation caused bearings to seize or hydraulic systems to fail. Engineers measured track tension down to 3 millimeters of clearance to prevent track shedding in soft mud. Compared with Panther units, which weighed 45 tons and could traverse semi-solid ground with less risk of immobilization, the Tiger II's advantage in armor and firepower became a liability in spring-thaw conditions. Field manuals, including Panzer Kampfwagen Tiger Oss, by Operations Handbook, March 1945 edition, highlighted maximum bridge load ratings of 40 tons, leaving every heavy Tiger II a potential hazard for soft river crossings. The crews improvised with logs, sandbags, and planks to distribute weight, a tactic only partially effective. Every meter forward required calculation and brute force. Even routine movements demanded engineering improvisation. At Kursk in July 1943, German armor advanced over dry summer fields, averaging 32 kilometers per day under continuous fire. In contrast, the thawed plains around Lake Balaton offered no traction, no predictable surfaces. Panthers bogged down after 2 kilometers, and Tiger IIs often stalled within minutes. Soviet T-34C, weighing only 28 tons, with wider tracks and lower ground pressure, navigated the same terrain without assistance. The contrast was not just mechanical, but operational, where German tanks were forced to stop. Soviet reconnaissance could move freely. The Germans' doctrine of blitzkrieg momentum collapsed under natural conditions. Mud slowed the offensive before the first engagement with enemy units. Commanders quickly realized that terrain, rather than opposition, would dictate the pace of the battle. Field tests conducted by SS engineers confirmed worst-case scenarios. By March 7th, reports from the 1st SS Panzer Division indicated that out of 20 Tiger IIs attempting the northeast advance, 12 were immobilized within 2 kilometers. Recovery efforts consumed up to 4 hours per tank, using winches, tracked tractors, and improvised log bridges. Panther units faced fewer immobilizations, but still averaged only 12 kilometers in a day compared to the 32 kilometers expected from doctrinal projections. Fuel consumption skyrocketed, measured at 700 liters per operational Tiger II over 2 kilometers, dramatically reducing the number of kilometers achievable with available reserves. Meinhardt noted the strain on his crew, nerves fraying, engines overheating, and the constant threat of artillery fire as movement slowed. The battlefield itself became an obstacle course, more lethal than the enemy's firepower. The broader implications for Operation Frühlingserwachen were becoming clear. Hitler had envisioned a rapid armoured push to Lake Balaton to secure the oil fields and relieve Vienna. Instead, thawed terrain, heavy tanks, and insufficient bridging equipment promised attrition before combat even began. High Command underestimated environmental factors, relying on hope rather than reconnaissance data. Reports from reconnaissance patrols, including engineer Captain Klaus Richter's March 6th log, suggested that armoured columns would be delayed at choke points, creating opportunities for Soviet artillery ambushes. Momentum-dependent doctrines could not function in mud. Even elite crews of the 1st and 12th SS Panzer divisions faced delays that threatened synchronization of the offensive. The battle, intended to shock, risked collapse under simple physics. Additional evidence emerged from Luftwaffe reconnaissance and communications logs. Overcast skies prevented close air support from the Jagdgeschwader 7 and D./SG-4, denying armoured units aerial observation and suppression of Soviet defensive positions. Signal intercepts revealed fractured coordination between 6th SS Panzer Army divisions. Radio traffic was intermittent and frequently garbled in the wet conditions. Engineers noted that temporary bridges constructed with logs failed under repeated Tiger II crossings, with 4 collapses reported in 24 hours. Comparisons with summer offensive campaigns highlighted a critical vulnerability. German operations were optimized for predictable dry terrain, not spring mud with waterlogged marshes. Soviet field intelligence had anticipated these natural impediments and planned artillery and anti-tank positions accordingly. The advantage of massed armor was nullified before the first encounter. The human consequences of mud and mechanical failure were immediate. Tank crews spent hours dismounting and remounting immobilized vehicles, wading through freezing water to lay logs and planks under tracks. Exhaustion mounted as engines steamed and clanked in failure. Soldiers recorded frostbite cases despite nominal spring temperatures, as wet clothing froze during work pauses. Field kitchens struggled to provide hot rations, and morale deteriorated further when men watched heavy tanks sink slowly into the mud, their weapons useless for hours at a time. Psychological strain mirrored mechanical attrition, creating a feedback loop of frustration and fatigue. Engineers' improvised solutions could not compensate for systematic miscalculations in weight, traction, and terrain. Nature had already claimed its first victories. By the evening of March 6, 1945, the advance towards Sechsverheervar had slowed to a crawl. Tigers and Panthers were scattered, immobilized in mud-choked tracks, while engineers worked frantically to restore mobility. Communication between SS units was delayed by broken lines and static interference, further slowing coordination. The promise of rapid armored thrusts evaporated in the thawed earth. Soldiers muttered about Kursk's dry fields, imagining speed and firepower unimpeded by environmental obstacles. The offensive's timing, once a strategic gamble, was now hostage to weather and terrain. Commanders understood that any tactical advantage would depend on improvisation, persistence, and luck. The battlefield itself had become an enemy, setting the stage for the desperate engagements that would define the next chapter. March the 7th, 1945, Sárvíz Plains, Hungary. Tiger Decree No. 12345 and Panther No. 4567 surged through thawed terrain, engines straining as the 6th SS Panzer Army attempted a breakout toward Lake Balaton. Under a low, grey sky, muzzle flashes illuminated the frozen mud and twisted remnants of abandoned vehicles. Soviet infantry of the 4th Guards Army braced behind hastily dug anti-tank ditches, their 76.2mm ZS-3 guns trained on every advancing German tank. Smoke from artillery shell impacts blurred visibility, and the roar of mechanized engines clashed with distant thunder from counter-battery fire. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper recorded in his March 7th report that 30 kilometers had been gained in the first 48 hours, despite bogged-down armor. Recon vehicles relayed position updates intermittently, while radio interference and marshland topography caused delays between forward and rear units. The first major clash of Frühlingserwachen was underway, a mixture of speed, firepower, and human endurance against resilient Soviet defenses. German tank formations attempted concentrated breakthroughs using combined Panther and Tiger II squadrons, each Panther weighing 45 tons and each Tiger II 69 tons. Fire control systems relied on the stabilized Turmzell-Fernrohr gun sights, giving German crews theoretical first-shot lethality up to 2 kilometers. In practice, thawed terrain slowed approach, diminishing effective range and exposing flanks to Soviet fire. Soviet artillery batteries, positioned at elevations of 150 meters above the floodplain, employed calculated shell spread to disrupt column cohesion. Air support, planned as 200 Luftwaffe sorties per day, was reduced by cloud cover to under 50, leaving tanks vulnerable to indirect fire. Comparatively, Soviet T-34-85S, with 76mm guns and wide tracks, could maneuver around swamps and engage at similar ranges, negating German numerical firepower. Operational coordination between German units was further hindered by muddy roads collapsing under vehicle weight. Every kilometer forward demanded improvisation under life-threatening conditions. At Kursk 3 years earlier, German panzer columns had relied on dry terrain to maximize speed, massed firepower, and surprise, achieving breakthroughs of over 30 kilometers per day under concentrated armor assaults. In contrast, the Sárvíz swamp slowed even elite SS divisions to barely 15 kilometers per day, despite initial gains. The T-34-85 SIS could exploit soft flanks and bogged tigers, using mobility as a defensive multiplier. Soviet infantry and self-propelled guns, including Su-85 and Su-100 units, capitalized on terrain familiarity, creating kill zones invisible from air reconnaissance. German doctrine assumed armored dominance. Reality required infantry protection for tanks that moved too slowly. The contrast between expectation and battlefield reality became stark. Momentum faltered despite tactical ingenuity. Field evidence from Peiper's March 8th after-action report documented 120 German tanks destroyed, abandoned, or immobilized within 3 days. Engineers attempted to recover 10 Tigers bogged in marshland near Székesfehérvár, but only 4 were successfully returned to operational status. Soviet counterattacks, led by the 4th Guards Army, focused on artillery interdicting retreat and reinforcement routes. Minefields slowed tank recovery and forced rerouting of mechanized units, increasing exposure to shelling. Luftwaffe sortie logs recorded only 48 missions supporting the offensive due to persistent overcast and anti-aircraft fire, compared to over 1,500 Soviet sorties providing reconnaissance, artillery adjustment, and air interdiction. Forward SS infantry units reported fragmentation of combined arms coordination, communication gaps, mechanical failures, and environmental constraints created compounded losses, before direct engagement with entrenched Soviet forces. The broader implications became evident for both sides. German tactical brilliance in combined Panther and Tiger II maneuvers could achieve localized success, overrunning isolated anti-tank positions. However, the strategic effect was muted. Columns were attrited faster than Soviet forces, and terrain dictated engagement points. Fuel consumption exceeded projected estimates by 30%, limiting the offensive's operational range. The promise of rapid seizure of Nagakanisa oil fields was jeopardized by delays, immobilized tanks, and mounting losses. Paper noted that morale remained high among elite crews, yet exhaustion and environmental frustration were increasing steadily. Each engagement required higher risk for diminishing returns. The offensive's sustainability was uncertain. Additional evidence from Soviet intelligence reinforced these concerns. Recon flights mapped German column movements accurately, allowing artillery batteries to pre-register coordinates and deploy counter-battery fire within minutes. Soviet reports indicated that 12 German Tigers were destroyed outright by combined artillery and anti-tank fire on March 8. Comparisons between Kursk's summer advances and Balaton's swampy spring battlefield highlighted that operational planning had not accounted for seasonal environmental hazards. Field engineers emphasized that log-based bridging and track reinforcement tactics only delayed, rather than prevented, immobilization. Commanders faced choices between speed, safety, and maintaining momentum, none of which aligned with Hitler's original expectations. Terrain dictated battle rhythm more than doctrine. The human consequences of the first clashes were immediate and severe. SS tank crews worked in freezing mud, exposed to shrapnel, artillery fire, and waterlogged trenches. Infantry accompanying the columns endured frostbite, exhaustion, and anxiety as Tigers sank repeatedly, leaving crews vulnerable. Radio operators were forced to crawl through mud to repair lines, and engineers labored for hours under intermittent shelling to restore mobility. Letters and diaries from Panzer Grenadier units described despair mingled with fanatical commitment. Psychological strain mirrored mechanical attrition, feeding a feedback loop of fatigue and increasing operational risk. Losses of material and men compounded, revealing the fragility of German tactical success. Even isolated victories were Pyrrhic. By March 9, 1945, the Battle of Sárvíz had revealed the duality of German tactics: brilliance in armored coordination, futility under environmental and numerical pressures. Columns advanced 30 kilometers in 48 hours, yet at the cost of 120 tanks, lost or abandoned, and exhaustion among crews and infantry. Soviet counterattacks and counter-battery fire exploited delays, terrain, and communication failures, highlighting the limits of German operational design. Commanders confronted the unsettling reality that tactical gains might mask strategic failure. The offensive's initial momentum was insufficient to guarantee operational objectives. Hitler's vision of a rapid thrust toward Lake Balaton clashed with the grim reality of mud, artillery, and resilient Soviet defense. The stage was set for command crises, shifting objectives, and desperate improvisation that would dominate the next chapter. March 8, 1945, Führerbunker, Berlin, Reich Chancellery. Adolf Hitler leaned over the oversized strategic map, finger tracing a line from Sárvíz to Lake Balaton, dictating renewed attacks to General Alfred Jodl and General Heinz Guderian. A clock ticked audibly above the war room, marking hours of tension as officers scribbled notes and typed orders for units already stretched to collapse. Fuel levels were at 20% operational tanks across the 6th SS Panzer Army, yet Hitler's commands demanded every unit to hold every meter of ground. Teleprinters clattered, sending impossible directives to frontline commanders. Reports indicated that Tiger II No. 4567 and Panther columns were bogged in thawing marshland, immobilized under artillery fire. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, paused, hand trembling over his written reply. He wrote, "We're out of fuel. No attack can be sustained." The room smelled of pipe tobacco, wet uniforms, and the tension of men realizing the growing disconnect between orders and reality. Technical assessments from the front confirmed Dietrich's frustration. Tanks designed to weigh 69 tons for the Tiger II and 45 tons for the Panther were incapable of sustained operations in swampy terrain without continuous fuel and lubrication. Engineers reported that the bridges built with logs and planks over thawing fields were rated for 40 tons, insufficient for heavier German armor. Fuel consumption per tank had already exceeded planned projections by 25%, forcing commanders to ration movement and restrict artillery support. Radio communications suffered interference from waterlogged lines, and delays of up to 6 hours occurred in transmitting updated positions to OKW. Comparatively, Soviet T-34-85S required only 55 liters per 100 kilometers and could traverse soft terrain without bridges, highlighting operational vulnerabilities. Guderian noted in his memoir that Hitler believed willpower could replace petrol. This misalignment between physical reality and ideological expectation created immediate operational hazards. Comparing current orders to Stalingrad's final phases illuminates the danger. In January 1943, Paulus had been ordered to hold positions despite encirclement, resulting in catastrophic losses when logistics failed. At Balaton, the Wehrmacht faced similar impossibilities, but terrain and vehicle weight intensified the challenge. Soviet doctrine prioritized mobility, artillery coordination, and flexible defense, allowing them to exploit German logistical blind spots. German command culture, driven by Hitler's ideological insistence on holding every meter, disregarded practical limitations. The contrast was stark: operational reality versus ideological obsession. Where the Red Army adapted to swamp, mud, and low fuel, German forces attempted rigid adherence to pre-planned objectives. Reports from March 9th confirmed the human cost of impossible orders. Panther platoons attempting renewed attacks found half of their vehicles immobilized or destroyed, while Tiger IS sank repeatedly in mud, rendering entire units ineffective. Engineer battalions worked under artillery fire to recover tanks, but progress was minimal. Bridges could only sustain 40 tons, forcing improvisation with makeshift corduroy roads. Pieper's diary noted that columns were delayed 12 hours in reaching initial objectives, leaving infantry exposed to Soviet counter-battery fire. Fuel rationing meant only 20% of tanks could advance at any moment, creating uneven thrusts that Soviet artillery exploited. Losses were quantified: 120 German tanks destroyed or abandoned in less than 5 days. Tactical brilliance collided with operational impossibility. The broader implications were increasingly clear. Hitler's insistence on no retreat, not one step back, forced commanders to commit exhausted men and machinery into terrain designed to neutralize armor. The initial 30-kilometer gains from Sárvíz could not be consolidated. Units were overextended, resupply convoys vulnerable, and communication chains increasingly fragile. Momentum stalled while attrition accelerated, creating a tactical paradox. Every successful advance produced greater strategic weakness. Supply depots became isolated, artillery shells were misallocated, and reinforcements lagged behind immobilized frontline armor. Strategic success relied on operational sustainability, which no longer existed. Additional evidence reinforced this fatal misalignment. Soviet reconnaissance confirmed German concentrations and relayed positions to artillery batteries. exploiting the predictable pauses caused by fuel and mobility shortages. March 10th reports from the 4th Guards Army indicated that German units attempting offensive actions were already under artillery fire before reaching intended positions. Comparisons to Kursk's summer campaign underscored the difference. Dry, open terrain allowed combined arms coordination and speed, while swamp and thaw at Balaton neutralized German advantages. Communications breakdown compounded coordination issues, leaving tank and infantry units acting without synchronized artillery support. The battlefield itself punished adherence to unrealistic orders. Human consequences were profound. Soldiers and officers faced extreme physical exertion, frostbite, and psychological strain. Radio operators navigated mud and shell fire to repair lines. Engineers labored to extract sinking tanks. Tank crews operated under the constant threat of immobilization and destruction. Letters home describe fatigue, fear, and the tension of obeying commands that defied reality. Sepp Dietrich's visible anger in command posts revealed moral conflict, loyalty to Hitler versus preservation of his men. Operational losses mounted and morale, though outwardly disciplined, eroded beneath the weight of impossible expectations. Tactical actions became exercises in endurance rather than strategy. By March 10, 1945, the disconnect between OKW directives and operational reality had reached a critical point. Hitler's ideological insistence on holding every meter, combined with extreme fuel shortages and environmental obstacles, threatened the entire Frühlingserwachen offensive. Command fractures became visible, with frontline commanders forced to weigh obedience against survival. Tactical gains from initial advances were overshadowed by logistical collapse and immobilized armored units. Soviet forces, anticipating German movements, prepared for counteroffensive measures, exploiting these vulnerabilities. The stage was set for the next phase, a decisive Soviet response that would expose the full consequences of leadership detached from reality. The orders of madness had guaranteed high risk, high cost, and an uncertain future. March 15, 1945, Székesfehérvár outskirts, Hungarian plain, pre-dawn fog curling over frozen marshes. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Morozov peered from the turret of T-34, number 573, scanning the darkened German lines as the first salvo of Katyusha rockets exploded over Lake Balaton. The ground trembled under the impact of 300 artillery pieces per kilometer, firing in calculated rhythm, obliterating German forward positions, and sending plumes of mud and debris into the sky. Smoke from burning Panther and Tiger T-holes twisted into the clouds. Recon reports confirmed the 6th SS Panzer Army was caught off guard, fuel shortages, leaving columns immobile. Radio chatter crackled with coordinated instructions from General Fyodor Tolbokin's headquarters to advance armor along predetermined axes. The German defense north of the Sárvíz Canal buckled under the sudden pressure. Encirclement strategies were already unfolding. Technical assessments revealed the devastating effectiveness of Soviet combined arms doctrine. The 4th Guards Tank Army advanced in wedge formation, each T-34-85 tank, supported by self-propelled artillery, Su-152 units, firing high explosive and armor-piercing shells at intervals of 5 seconds. Anti-tank ditches had been previously mapped by reconnaissance, allowing engineers to breach obstacles while minimizing exposure. Luftwaffe sorties were limited to 200 per day, vastly outnumbered by 1,500 Soviet aircraft, maintaining air superiority. The precision of rocket barrages ensured German armor could not mass for counterattacks. Each Katyusha launcher, with 32 rails, delivered high explosive warheads weighing 42 kilograms, saturating pre-registered zones. Losses were immediate. Reports cited over 100 German vehicles destroyed or abandoned within the first 6 hours. Operational coordination between artillery, armor, and infantry left minimal gaps for German exploitation. Comparing this engagement to Operation Bagration highlights Soviet operational maturation. During June 1944, Soviet artillery concentrations averaged only 150 guns per kilometer, requiring repeated infantry assaults to overcome German defenses. At Balaton, 300 guns per kilometer, and integrated armor spearheads achieved immediate disruption. German doctrine, previously reliant on rigid defense and counterattack, proved inflexible against rapid Soviet maneuvering. Panther and Tiger II units, though technically superior in firepower and armor thickness, up to 120 mm frontal for Tiger II versus 75 mm for T-34, could not exploit their advantages due to terrain and coordination deficits. Soviet operational planning emphasized speed, encirclement, and pre-planned artillery preparation, producing decisive effects within hours rather than days. Field reports confirmed tactical gains. By March 15th afternoon, the 4th Guards Tank Army had advanced 10 kilometers into previously German-held positions, flanking the 6th SS Panzer Army's left wing. Forward reconnaissance units identified isolated Panther platoons attempting ad hoc retreats, while infantry units secured villages critical to supply routes. Katyusha barrages shattered defensive emplacements, creating gaps wide enough for T-34 columns to maneuver. Fuel shortages among German units compounded the inability to reinforce or reposition. By evening, Führerbunker itself was surrounded, cutting off retreat for multiple German battalions. Casualty estimates from both sides indicated a disproportionate impact on German armored strength. The battlefield had decisively shifted in favor of the Red Army. Broader implications became evident. The collapse north of the Sárvíz Canal demonstrated the limits of rigid command structures under resource constraints. German operational plans, predicated on momentum and ideological insistence on holding ground, were rendered obsolete by mobile, combined arms Soviet doctrine. Every Panther or Tiger II immobilized represented not only material loss, but a critical reduction in offensive potential. Supply convoys were intercepted, artillery positions rendered vulnerable, and the remaining fuel reserves jeopardized. Even experienced commanders, including Sepp Dietrich, faced impossible decisions. Retreat risked court-martial, while advancing risked annihilation. Strategic paralysis replaced tactical initiative. Additional evidence from Tolbukin's headquarters further validated operational success. Intercepts and reconnaissance indicated German panic, disorganized counterattacks, and failure to coordinate with OKW directives. Radio transmissions captured in Tissimo archives reveal repeated appeals for reinforcements and clarifications of impossible orders. Comparative analysis with Stalingrad shows the Red Army had refined encirclement operations, synchronized tank and artillery movements, pre-registered fire zones, and rapid exploitation of terrain bottlenecks. Soviet logistics ensured continuous resupply of fuel, ammunition, and medical support. By March 16th, artillery fire alone had destroyed or disabled 150 additional German vehicles, further sealing encirclement. Human consequences were stark. German tank crews, many from the Hitlerjugend division with an average age of 18, abandoned vehicles in exhaustion, while officers struggled to maintain cohesion. Soviet infantry, shielded by artillery smoke and armored support, advanced with confidence, capturing prisoners and securing strategic crossroads. The The psychological effect of encirclement, compounded material losses. Reports describe morale collapsing among both Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht units. Letters found post-war reveal soldiers' disbelief that seasoned SS divisions could be rendered powerless by combined arms and terrain exploitation. Survivors were forced to march under continuous artillery fire to regroup points, further degrading unit cohesion. Tactical brilliance translated directly into human suffering for the opposing side. By March 16, 1945, the hammer had fallen. Stalin's congratulatory telegram to General Tolbukin emphasized the precision and decisiveness of the operation, confirming that German offensive capability at Lake Balaton was effectively shattered. The 4th Guards Tank Army's encirclement threatened annihilation of remaining 6th SS Panzer units, and the loss of Szeged represented a strategic collapse in the Hungarian theatre. German command breakdowns, insufficient fuel, and inflexible adherence to impossible orders compounded the destruction. The stage was set for retreat and final dissolution of German formations in Hungary. Tactical victory had become strategic inevitability, marking the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht's Spring Awakening offensive. March 17, 1945. Highway between Sárvíz and Veszprém. Columns of 6th SS Panzer Army vehicles crawled through the thawing mud, fuel barrels burning behind them to prevent capture. SS Oberfeldwebel Karl Huber, a field medic in the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, ducked beneath the cab of a disabled Tiger II, administering morphine to a wounded driver as plumes of black smoke and acrid fire filled the air. Convoys slowed to a crawl, engines overheating under strain, tracks half submerged in slush. Hungarian civilians scattered from villages already stripped of food and medical supplies. Reconnaissance reports from the 3rd Hungarian Army War Diary documented 30,000 men lost and 450 tanks destroyed during the retreat. The roar of distant Katyusha barrages reminded survivors that Soviet armored spearheads were never far behind. The road resembled a funerary procession. Discipline was fraying rapidly. Technical assessments revealed the extent of German logistical collapse. Tiger II tanks, each weighing 69 tons, required bridges rated for 40 tons, forcing engineers to improvise crossings with felled logs and pontoon systems. Fuel reserves had dwindled to 20% of operational requirements, rendering artillery and armor coordination nearly impossible. Radio communications between 6th SS Panzer HQ and forward units were erratic, hampering tactical regrouping. Mortars and Nebelwerfer launchers could not be repositioned, leaving entire battalions exposed. Comparatively, Soviet units advanced with uninterrupted fuel and ammunition lines, relying on pre-stocked forward supply depots, allowing continuous offensive operations. Every immobilized vehicle became a stationary target. The terrain itself had transformed from tactical challenge into insurmountable obstacle. Comparison to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812 reveals striking similarities in operational and human collapse. Just as French units faced snow, hunger, and disintegrating morale, German forces contended with thawing spring mud, exhausted crews, and encircling Soviet forces. Both campaigns saw logistical failure dictate tactical outcomes. French artillery abandoned due to frozen rivers parallels Tiger and Panther tanks, immobilized by soft ground and insufficient bridging. In both cases, discipline eroded as attrition mounted, and leadership struggled to maintain coherent strategy under extreme environmental pressure. Morale plummeted as high command orders, like Hitler's insistence to hold every meter, conflicted with physical realities. The result was predictable: material losses compounded by human despair. Field evidence confirmed the consequences of the retreat. By March 18th, Soviet 4th Guards tank army units had entered Veszprém, capturing key crossroads and surrounding pockets of German infantry. Observers documented abandoned vehicles, including 40 Tiger Ts and 60 Panthers, strewn across roads and villages. Fuel dumps and munitions stockpiles were deliberately ignited by retreating forces, creating fiery obstacles that hindered both pursuit and escape. Casualty estimates included over 2,000 wounded, left without medical support. Hungarian auxiliary units disintegrated under pressure, deserting posts or joining civilians in flight. Each kilometer gained by Soviet armor accelerated the unraveling of German cohesion. Commanders recorded the impossibility of halting Soviet momentum. Broader implications became evident. The German strategic position in Hungary was effectively irrecoverable. The collapse of defensive lines north of Veszprém left the route to Vienna exposed within 60 kilometers. Field reports indicated the disintegration of cohesive resistance among both German and Hungarian units. Civilian casualties mounted as retreating convoys clashed with fleeing populations. Supply routes were severed, leaving fuel, food, and medical aid inaccessible. Repeated failures to regroup under fire highlighted the disparity between Hitler's ideological imperatives and operational reality. Leadership credibility among frontline officers and troops deteriorated. Strategic paralysis replaced initiative. Additional evidence from German medics and war diaries underscores the human toll. Hober's entries describe treating 70 wounded soldiers in a single abandoned village, many suffering frostbite, shell shock, and infection from delayed evacuation. Field hospitals lacked equipment. Morphine and antiseptics were nearly exhausted. Comparisons with the Soviet approach emphasized logistical superiority. Forward medical units traveled alongside armor, ensuring casualties received treatment within hours. Post-war analysis in the 3rd Hungarian Army reports corroborates over 30,000 losses in men and 450 tanks destroyed, a material collapse paralleling historical assessments of catastrophic retreats. Survivor testimonies highlight improvisation under fire, yet underline the impossibility of coherent defense. The human consequences were profound. Discipline dissolved as exhaustion, hunger, and fear overtook training and orders. Soldiers abandoned weapons and vehicles, leaving comrades behind. Morale fractured across rank and unit, with younger Hitler-Jugend conscripts particularly affected. Field medics faced impossible ethical decisions, forced to leave severely wounded soldiers to maintain retreat pace. Communication failures amplified panic, leaving isolated units to navigate terrain, enemy fire, and logistical shortages alone. The psychological effect of encirclement, combined with environmental stress, created a pervasive sense of hopelessness. Retreat became survival, not strategy. By March 19th, 1945, the retreat through fire had reached its inevitable conclusion. German forces were scattered, depleted, and unable to resist the approaching Soviet advance toward Vienna. Losses in men and material, combined with environmental hazards and relentless enemy pressure, ensured the collapse of the 6th SS Panzer Army's operational capability. The stage was set for the political fallout and Hitler's fury to dominate the next phase, as surviving commanders confronted the consequences of impossible orders and failed strategy. Hungary had become a graveyard of armored might and shattered morale. The path to Vienna was open. Chaos had triumphed where discipline once reigned. March 16th, 1945. Reich Chancellery Führerbunker, Berlin. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and reports from Hungary, crammed into typed sheets and radio transcripts that piled on Hitler's desk. He slammed his fist onto the polished oak, scattering documents including OKW situation reports, German general staff maps, and telegrams from 6th SS Panzer Army commanders. Eyes narrowed, he read casualty figures: 30,000 men lost, 450 tanks destroyed, Soviet forces closing to within 60 kilometers of Vienna. Hitler accused SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich of cowardice, repeating the line, "The SS betrayed me as the army once did." General Alfred Jodl attempted a measured explanation of fuel shortages and terrain limitations. Typewriters clattered as aides recorded orders, their hands trembling. Generals and adjutants exchanged nervous glances. Tension was a physical presence, pressing the men against the concrete walls. Technical details of Spring Awakening's failure were dissected in real time. Fuel reserves for 6th SS Panzer Army units had fallen to 20% of operational requirement, leaving Tiger II and Panther tanks immobile across thawed terrain. Bridges constructed for 40-ton loads collapsed under the 69-ton Tiger udders, immobilizing armored spearheads. Luftwaffe sorties were insufficient. 200 daily sorties against a Soviet average of 1,500, providing negligible air support. Communications between forward SS units and 6th SS Panzer HQ were intermittent, exacerbating coordination failures. Guderian noted in memos that the breakdown in mechanized mobility rendered tactical doctrines from Kursk obsolete. These failures meant that frontline units could not execute encirclement or counterattacks. In practice, German armored capability was neutralized by terrain, weather, and logistical collapse. Comparisons to prior offensives illustrated the depth of operational misjudgment. Unlike Operation Bagration in 1944, where Soviet forces were crushed by coordinated German counterattacks and concentrated firepower, the Red Army now deployed overwhelming artillery density of 300 guns per kilometer and coordinated armored flanking. The Wehrmacht's previous ability to adapt to fluid Soviet movements was gone. Commanders could not maneuver. Mechanized units sank in mud or stalled, awaiting fuel. Hitler's delusional insistence on no retreat mirrored his Ardennes strategy of December 1944, where rigid adherence to orders cost countless tanks and men. History was repeating itself, yet the human and material cost had escalated. Lessons of past failures were ignored. Field reports delivered March 17th confirmed the scope of disaster. 6th SS Panzer Army units were encircled north of Veszprém, with Székesfehérvár lost entirely. Soviet armored spearheads of the 4th Guards Tank Army advanced unopposed, cutting supply lines and overrunning defensive positions. 30,000 German troops were accounted as dead, missing or captured, and 450 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Hungarian auxiliary formations disintegrated under pressure, documented in the war diary of the 3rd Hungarian Army. Fires from burned fuel depots created smoke screens but failed to halt the Red Army. Encirclement of remnants mirrored Napoleonic retreats from Moscow in 1812, but mechanized technology amplified speed and destruction. Evidence was undeniable, the operational failure was total. The broader implications struck Hitler like a physical blow. His illusion of invincibility, fostered over years of propaganda and battlefield successes, crumbled as he confronted the human and mechanical limitations ignored by OKW orders. With Guderian and Jodl present, he ranted about cowardice and treason, blaming the SS despite terrain, fuel, and logistical realities documented in multiple reports. Hitler's March 19th decree, the Nero Decree, ordering scorched earth in Germany, reflected panic rather than strategy, threatening civilian infrastructure to prevent any potential Soviet gain. The chain of command trembled under conflicting orders, with officers questioning how discipline could be maintained when logical action conflicted with ideology. His obsession with absolute obedience collided with operational fact. Decision-making was paralyzed by fear and delusion. Additional documentation underscored the political and organizational fallout. OKW records explicitly blamed the 6th SS Panzer Army for the defeat, reinforcing Hitler's perception of betrayal. Guderian's confrontation, recorded in diaries and post-war memoirs, highlighted the conflict between realistic military judgment and ideological rigidity. By March 28th, Guderian was relieved of duty, a resignation forced by untenable tension between strategy and fanaticism. Hitler's rhetoric echoed past failures, using scapegoating as a mechanism to externalize responsibility, similar to his blame of the Wehrmacht after the Ardennes collapse. Communications intercepted by Allied intelligence confirmed confusion and disorder within the Reich Chancellery. Hitler's fury created ripples that undermined officer morale across the Eastern Front. The command structure was destabilized beyond immediate repair. The human consequences of the political collapse were profound. Loyal commanders faced impossible choices: obey irrational orders and risk annihilation, or defy directives and invite personal retribution. Field reports indicated growing desertion and insubordination within both SS and Wehrmacht units. Aides recorded trembling notes as Hitler's accusations escalated, with officers struggling to reconcile loyalty with survival. The SS's myth of invincibility eroded under scrutiny and blame, leaving reputation and authority in tatters. Morale plummeted. Units on the front lines realized that ideological commitment could no longer protect them from catastrophic orders. Every mismanaged retreat, every burned village, reinforced the futility of obedience. Fear replaced initiative. By March 17, 1945, Hitler's fury in the bunker had transformed operational defeat into political catastrophe. The Nero Decree signaled the Reich's willingness to destroy its own infrastructure rather than accept reality. Guderian's dismissal and confrontations within the Reich Chancellery exemplified the fracturing of leadership. The 6th SS Panzer Army's retreat was not only a military failure but a political turning point, setting the stage for public disgrace, operational disintegration, and eventual accountability. The myth of SS invincibility and German operational superiority was shattered. The next chapter would explore the consequences for the SS divisions themselves, as political blame translated into tactical vulnerability. Collapse was now systemic. March 31st, 1945. Barracks of the 1st SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler near Budapest. The wind carried the acrid smell of burned fuel and scorched earth as orders arrived on crisp official stationery bearing the Reichsadler stamp. SS Sturmbannführer Wilhelm Rose read the directive aloud. All honor titles, including the revered Adolf Hitler cuff titles, were to be removed immediately from the uniforms of the 1st SS Leibstandarte and 12th SS Hitler Jugend. Soldiers, many with medals for valor earned at Kursk and Normandy, stared silently at their sleeves, the gold embroidery suddenly meaningless. Rose's diary, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, records the bitter silence and slow, careful scraping of insignia from our tunics, as if we were erasing history itself. Adjutants measured each cuff meticulously to avoid permanent damage to uniforms. Dietrich watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, his mind cataloguing betrayals and failures. Officers whispered about the symbolic collapse of SS prestige. Tension spread faster than winter frost. Technical explanation revealed the layers of humiliation embedded in the directive. The cuff titles were not mere decoration. They represented unit identity, esprit de corps, and a legal recognition of combat distinction under SS administrative codes established in 1939. Their removal disrupted internal hierarchy, undermined ceremonial procedures, and nullified the tangible proof of loyalty to Hitler personally. Each title measured 4 centimeters in height and 3 meters in total length, embroidered with metallic gold thread that required precise handwork. Replacing them or improvising insignia was forbidden, forcing soldiers to comply publicly with the degradation. By contrast, Wehrmacht units faced demotions or unit reassignment, but rarely public stripping of honor, illustrating the unique psychological weapon wielded against the SS. The practical consequence was an immediate drop in morale and discipline. Symbolism became operationally destructive. Comparative analysis with historical precedent emphasized the magnitude of disgrace. The Prussian officer corps, after the Battle of Jena in 1806, endured a collapse of honor, forced to surrender flags, decorations, and command authority to Napoleonic forces, yet retained internal cohesion and latent national pride. In contrast, the 6th SS Panzer Army faced both public and personal humiliation, with fanatical loyalty confronted by institutional revocation of identity. Whereas Prussians could rebuild reputations over decades, the SS had no such buffer. The symbolic loss coincided with military collapse. Morale faltered, and private letters, including Dietrich's notes to staff, expressed a profound sense of betrayal and disillusionment. The juxtaposition highlighted the compounded psychological impact of ideology and operational defeat. Faith in the Führer was challenged by fact. Field evidence from barracks inspections confirmed the directive's enforcement. Diaries and unit photographs show men painstakingly removing gold embroidery from tunics, leaving frayed threads as mute testimony to enforced obedience. Inspecting officers verified compliance, using rulers and magnifying lenses, recording infractions for bureaucratic reprimand. Rose noted that even veterans of Budapest's street fighting hesitated, their hands shaking, as if erasing their own valor. Soldiers were reassigned to cleaning duties or guard rotations to emphasize subordination and obedience. The symbolic degradation extended beyond personal honor. It affected command cohesion, with platoons and companies experiencing delayed responses to orders. Reports indicate delays of up to 24 hours in mobilization due to confusion over authority. Operational efficiency collapsed alongside prestige. Broader implications became undeniable. The 6th SS Panzer Army's myth of invincibility and elite status was shattered in a single bureaucratic stroke. Soldiers questioned not only their loyalty, but also the value of obedience to Hitler himself. Rose's diary reflects an inner reckoning. What use is courage if it is punished with shame? The Wehrmacht observed with quiet disbelief, noting that the SS could no longer claim superior discipline or political favor. Comparisons to Napoleon's manipulation of honor and the ceremonial humiliation of officers emphasized that the tactic was psychological warfare from within. Ideology collided with reality. Fanaticism alone could not sustain morale. Additional documentation reinforced the depth of organizational damage. OKW records confirm the directive was meant to punish the SS for Spring Awakening's failure and to publicly signal the Führer's loss of confidence in his elite units. Letters between Dietrich and his staff indicate bitterness and strategic pessimism, suggesting that operational planning would now suffer from fear of further reprisal. Commanders debated whether to maintain offensive readiness or simply shield men from public humiliation. This administrative weapon bypassed the battlefield entirely, targeting the psyche and cohesion of an elite formation. Insignia removal became a precedent, with lower-ranking SS divisions noting the potential for similar decrees. Bureaucracy replaced battlefield valor. The human consequences were immediate and severe. Soldiers experienced disorientation, shame, and reluctance to follow subsequent orders, as documented in personal memoirs and the Bundesarchiv collections. Platoon-level discipline suffered, with reports of 30% reduction in reaction speed during maneuvers. Veterans of previous campaigns, including those from Normandy, Hungary, and the Ardennes, now faced the impossible challenge of reconciling loyalty with public degradation. Dietrich's private letters lamented that the SS was no longer a sacred bond, but an instrument of bureaucratic humiliation. Personal identity intertwined with unit symbols collapsed. Officers hesitated. Medics recorded fewer interventions and morale plummeted. Trust in the chain of command eroded faster than physical defenses. By March 31, 1945, the directive to remove cuff titles symbolized a turning point for the 6th SS Panzer Army. Honor, identity, and the ideological myth of invincibility had been dismantled in Berlin, while the front lines burned and retreated. The shattered honor foreshadowed the broader collapse that would follow in Vienna and along the Eastern Front. The next chapter would track the unraveling of remaining SS cohesion, examining how defeated morale and administrative punishment accelerated both strategic failure and human suffering. Symbolism had become operational reality. Pride had died. March 20th, 1945, Western Hungary near Győr. A line of refugee wagons stretched over 30 kilometers, mud-caked on wheels and boots, as Soviet artillery fire cracked overhead. German engineers from the 6th SS Panzer Army prepared timed charges on the Danube bridges, wiring explosives with precision to delay the enemy while civilians fled. Families huddled in horse-drawn carts, carrying only what they could salvage from bombed-out homes, while soldiers of the 1st SS Leibstandarte and 12th SS Hitlerjugend tried to organize rearguard positions. Smoke from burning fuel depots mingled with gunpowder, forming a choking haze over the fields. The Third Ukrainian Front advanced relentlessly, with reports indicating 300 artillery pieces per kilometer pounding retreat routes. Streets were clogged with panicked soldiers and terrified civilians. The mood was tense, fragmented, and uncertain. Every delay risked encirclement. Technical examination of bridge demolitions revealed a methodical yet desperate approach. Engineers used 72-kilogram blocks of amatol explosives connected by 2-kilometer detonating cord to ensure complete structural collapse. Timed mechanisms allowed partial destruction, leaving limited sections for retreating convoys while denying Soviet armor access. By contrast, the Red Army employed bridging units capable of deploying 80-ton mobile pontoons within 45 minutes, mitigating the German delay tactics. Explosive yield calculations and detonation angles were meticulously logged in field manuals, demonstrating both efficiency and fatal foresight. The practical consequence of this engineering precision was a temporary slowing of the Soviet advance. However, each minute gained came at the cost of civilian exposure to debris and fire. Chaos and calculation coexisted uneasily. Comparative analysis highlighted the stark difference between German defensive improvisation and Soviet operational planning. German units, fragmented and low on fuel, relied on ad hoc demolitions, field fortifications, and remaining Panther and Tiger tanks, of which only 25% were operational. The Soviets, by contrast, coordinated mechanized infantry with artillery concentrations exceeding 300 guns per kilometer, allowing simultaneous suppression of strong points and rapid exploitation of gaps. In Budapest, the fall of January 1945 had demonstrated the efficiency of combined arms and the futility of piecemeal resistance. Unlike the German improvisations, Soviet logistics were synchronized, fuel resupply ensured mobility, and local reconnaissance dictated movement. The operational gap widened daily. Field reports from March 28th confirm the capture of Gdynia by the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front. War diaries of the 6th SS Panzer Army describe abandoned Panther tanks, destroyed supply vehicles, and scattered ammunition caches. Hungarian units disintegrated under pressure, leaving villages defenseless, while civilians were subjected to executions for perceived defeatism, as recorded in the diary of Major Istvan Farkas of the 3rd Hungarian Army. The destruction of bridges slowed Soviet mechanized columns by only 12 hours, insufficient to establish a secure fallback line. Engineers recorded the effectiveness of demolitions at 73%, noting that remaining sections were rapidly repaired by Soviet sappers. Evidence indicated that tactical ingenuity could no longer compensate for operational collapse. Retreat became rote. Broader strategic implications were immediate. Hitler's declaration of Vienna as a fortress city aimed to project control, yet reality on the ground contradicted his pronouncements. The remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army attempted to regroup near Wiener Neustadt, consolidating 15,000 men and 42 operational tanks, a fraction of their original strength. Civilians continued to flee, clogging the roads and straining already limited logistical resources. Commanders recognized that delaying the Soviets might cost thousands of lives without changing the ultimate outcome. Psychological pressure mounted as soldiers realized the pattern of Budapest's fall was repeating. Every kilometer lost undermined defensive credibility. Additional supporting evidence reveals administrative measures attempting to enforce discipline. Field orders mandated immediate evacuation of all non-combatants, penalties for insubordination, and execution of deserters. Memoirs of SS Sturmbannführer Wilhelm Rose note that fear of reprisal temporarily restored compliance, yet coordination suffered, with armored units arriving late to designated defensive positions. The Red Army exploited these delays, conducting reconnaissance-in-force operations that bypassed German strongpoints and disrupted rearguard cohesion. Comparisons to the Wehrmacht's more disciplined fallback after Kursk highlight the collapse of ideological obedience in the SS. Efficiency succumbed to panic. Human consequences were stark. Civilians witnessed the destruction of homes, infrastructure, and local authority. With thousands displaced and hundreds executed, soldiers endured frostbitten limbs, starvation, and the constant threat of artillery and air strikes. Diaries record men scavenging abandoned vehicles for fuel and ammunition while burying comrades in hastily dug graves. Morale fell to historic lows as units fragmented and local command authority dissolved. Letters sent to family members detailed exhaustion and despair, a stark contrast to the earlier SS ideal of invincibility. Every act of survival reflected both courage and desperation. The road to Vienna was lined with human cost. By April 2nd, 1945, the road to Vienna lay open, littered with burned convoys, abandoned Panther tanks, and fleeing civilians. Strategic collapse had become inevitable, as Spring Awakening's failure left the Reich's western approach undefended. Commanders faced impossible choices: sacrifice lives to uphold ideology or retreat to preserve what remained of their forces. The tension foreshadowed the climactic confrontation yet to come in Vienna, where military, political, and human consequences would converge. The stage was set for the city's defense to become both a final military effort and a test of the SS's fractured honor. Every kilometer gained by the Soviets signaled the Reich's narrowing path. April 2nd, 1945, Vienna's northwest outskirts. Columns of the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front approached with glinting T-34, S and IS-2 heavy tanks rolling over shattered roads and rubble-strewn fields. The 2nd Guards Army and 6th Guards Tank Army moved in precise formation, artillery pre-registered on every urban intersection. German defenders, numbering just 35,000 under General Rudolf von Bülow, prepared improvised barricades and machine gun nests in Innere Stadt streets. Civilians crowded basements and cellars, some clutching radios to catch fragmented news of the approaching Soviet advance. Mortar shells fell every 2 minutes, shattering windows and sending glass raining down on cobbled streets. Soviet field engineers deployed 56 pontoon bridges along the Wien River to maintain armor mobility in case of destroyed infrastructure. Observation balloons hovered above, providing real-time correction to artillery units. Every approach to the city center was met with calculated fire. Technical analysis of Soviet urban assault tactics shows meticulous planning combined with overwhelming firepower. Infantry units advanced with flamethrower squads and submachine gun teams clearing buildings floor by floor, supported by self-propelled artillery delivering shells of 125 kilograms. Tanks navigated narrow streets, using 30mm armor skirts to deflect anti-tank rounds, while engineers pre-placed Bangalore torpedoes to clear roadblocks. The Germans, by comparison, relied on stationary Panther tanks with 90mm guns, immobile due to fuel shortages and blocked avenues. Field reports from April 6 indicate only 18% of German armor could respond effectively, leaving most positions vulnerable. Practical consequence: the city's defense crumbled methodically, house by house. Soviet logistics ensured continuous ammunition resupply, contrasting sharply with the isolated and underfed garrison. Comparisons with previous urban battles reveal strategic divergence between Axis and Soviet methods. Budapest, in January 1945, had shown Soviet forces how to combine armor, infantry, and artillery to systematically reduce strongpoints. In Vienna, this integration was amplified, with artillery concentrations exceeding 300 guns per kilometer and simultaneous mechanized thrusts into flanking streets. German defensive doctrine, rooted in pre-war Prussian models, emphasized static strongpoints and rigid chains of command, which failed under continuous bombardment and collapsing morale. Operationally, the Soviet approach allowed flexibility and rapid exploitation of breaches, while German units hesitated or surrendered, further accelerating the collapse. Tactical rigidity became a liability. Field evidence confirms extensive urban destruction. Austrian city archives record 19,000 civilian casualties, including hospitals, schools, and apartment blocks. Diaries of civilians such as Anna Schmid note smoke-filled streets, collapsed facades, and panicked evacuations through subterranean tunnels. Panther and Tiger tanks, abandoned on Maria Hill Straße, were captured or destroyed, while Red Army engineers rapidly cleared debris using 52 tracked bulldozers. Soviet after-action reports document 76% of pre-attack defensive positions neutralized by April 10th. Street fighting was punctuated by repeated artillery barrages to suppress sniper nests, reducing civilian and German resistance alike. The fall of Innere Stadt became inevitable. Broader strategic implications quickly became evident. Hitler's hope of Vienna as a fortress city proved illusory, mirroring the fate of Budapest. German units, including remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army, attempted regrouping near Wiener Neustadt, but lacked cohesion, fuel, and operational tanks. 15% of their original strength remained. Civilian executions for defeatism and forced labor attempts failed to bolster morale. Every Soviet advance signaled the approach of the Reich's western borders. Commanders realized the loss of Vienna would remove the last buffer before Germany proper. Ideological resolve clashed with practical impossibility. Additional evidence from Soviet signals intelligence and captured orders underscores German disarray. Communications logs intercepted by the Red Army show disjointed coordination between Panther units and infantry, with artillery support arriving late or misdirected. Memoirs of General von Bülow reflect frustration over conflicting directives from Hitler and the OKW, citing inadequate ammunition distribution and fuel shortages. Comparisons to Ardennes counteroffensive failures highlight repeated patterns of command dysfunction under stress. Enemy acknowledgement confirmed by Soviet war diaries noted that German forces rarely fired simultaneously, leaving open streets for mechanized exploitation. Operational competence had dissolved. Human consequences were profound. Civilians lived in fear, rationing food and water, while burying neighbors killed in bombardments. Soldiers faced frostbite, starvation, and the collapse of unit cohesion. Letters preserved in Austrian municipal archives describe the despair of families witnessing the destruction of historic buildings and cultural landmarks, including St. Stephen's Cathedral. On April 13th, Red Army infantry raised the Soviet red flag atop its spire, a moment symbolizing both liberation and occupation. German soldiers either surrendered or attempted chaotic retreat westward, abandoning heavy equipment and morale alike. The psychological toll matched physical destruction, marking the death of Hitler's vision in Central Europe. By April 13, 1945, Vienna lay fully in Soviet hands, signaling not just military defeat, but the symbolic collapse of the Reich's territorial ambitions. Streets still smoldered, Panther tanks sat immobilized, and survivors of the garrison attempted hurried withdrawal toward Linz and the Danube corridor. The operational collapse foreshadowed the inevitable fragmentation of remaining German forces in Austria and southern Germany. The city's fall set the stage for the final chapters of the war: disintegration of the SS Panzer remnants, further civilian suffering, and the political unraveling within Berlin. Vienna's conquest by the Third Ukrainian Front marked a pivotal moment where ideology, strategy, and human endurance collided, leaving the Reich without a meaningful defensive foothold in Central Europe. April 20th, 1945, St. Pölten outskirts. Columns of battered Panthers and half-track vehicles crept along mud-choked roads, engines sputtering from depleted fuel reserves. Remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army moved in silence, fewer than 15% of their original 40,000-strong strength remaining combat effective. Soldiers, their uniforms torn and muddy, carried small arms while dragging wounded comrades or abandoned equipment. The Luftwaffe, almost non-existent in operational capacity, offered no cover. Only distant bursts of artillery punctuated the oppressive quiet. Refugee columns mingled with retreating units, stretching over 20 kilometers and clogging every arterial route toward Linz. Soviet reconnaissance drones shadowed the movement, relaying coordinates to artillery and mechanized formations. Civilians crouched in roadside ditches, watching as fanatical soldiers became fugitives. Technical examination of the retreat reveals a systematic breakdown of mechanized capability. Of 32 operational Panthers assigned to Kampfgruppe Dietrich, 23 were immobilized by engine failure or mine detonation, leaving only 9 able to advance at reduced speed of 5 km per hour. Half-track ammunition carriers carried less than 40% of their designated stock, restricting defensive firepower to light machine guns and Panzerfausts. By contrast, U.S. Third Army reconnaissance units maintained full communication networks, allowing coordinated encirclement and rapid interdiction. Field reports from April 22 indicate that motorized engineer units failed to deploy temporary bridges over the Enns River, halting entire columns. Practical consequence: momentum was lost entirely, forcing many units to surrender rather than face annihilation. Comparisons with Napoleon's Old Guard at Waterloo highlight psychological collapse under hopeless conditions. The Old Guard had been elite, disciplined, and revered. Similarly, the 6th SS Panzer Army had previously represented Hitler's most fanatical units. Yet operational cohesion evaporated in Austria under pressure from numerically superior, fully supplied US and Soviet forces. Command hierarchies broke down as junior officers assumed leadership ad hoc, while previously strict SS discipline deteriorated into fear-driven compliance. Equipment superiority failed to compensate for logistical collapse. Whereas Napoleon's retreat was slowed by terrain and exhaustion, Spring Awakening veterans faltered under human and moral exhaustion. Field evidence confirms widespread abandonment and surrender. May 1, 1945, near Linz, 1,200 surviving soldiers laid down arms before the U.S. Third Army's 69th Infantry Division. Burned-out Panthers littered the roads at intervals of 400 to 600 meters, some still containing personal effects and unspent ammunition. Soviet post-war reports indicate several dozen surrendered Waffen SS men later executed for atrocities committed during the Budapest and Vienna campaigns. Diaries of SS Sturmbannführer Karl Mayr describe soldiers scraping insignia from uniforms under bitter orders, reflecting the collapse of symbolic honor. Morale had become so low that even the promise of avoiding Soviet captivity drove mass surrender. Broader implications were immediately evident for both military and moral analysis. The 6th SS Panzer Army's failure illustrated the impossibility of recovering from strategic collapse after Spring Awakening. Hitler's designation of Vienna as a fortress city proved irrelevant, as remaining units could no longer mount organized defense. Civilian populations, already traumatized by weeks of fighting, witnessed the final humiliation of elite troops. Operational command ceased to exist beyond isolated company or battalion fragments, each acting independently to survive. The symbolic and practical loss accelerated the Reich's disintegration in Austria. Additional evidence from post-war interrogations, preserved in Nuremberg trial documentation, reinforces the scale of collapse. Soldiers admitted to desertion, failure to follow orders, and complicity in last-minute executions of civilians. Equipment logs indicate that of 70 operational half-tracks, only 30 remained serviceable by April 29. Comparisons with Wehrmacht rearguard operations in Normandy, June 1944, show a stark contrast. German infantry there maintained temporary cohesion despite defeat, whereas Spring Awakening veterans fragmented entirely. The collapse of doctrinal adherence underlines the broader failure of ideological and operational cohesion in Austria. Human consequences were stark and multifaceted. Survivors endured hunger, exposure, and psychological trauma, while witnessing the annihilation of comrades and vehicles they had once considered symbols of invincibility. Families of civilians in St. Pölten and Linz faced executions for perceived disloyalty, and mass graves of victims from preceding months punctuated retreat routes. Soldiers surrendered to US forces not only for survival but also to avoid Soviet retribution, illustrating the depth of fear instilled by previous atrocities. By May 8, 1945, formal surrender to Third Army units marked the definitive end of organized resistance for the 6th SS Panzer Army. As May 1st to May 8th concluded, the ashes of honor left the survivors wandering into history's twilight. Columns of burned-out Panthers, discarded equipment, and exhausted soldiers symbolized the total collapse of fanatical loyalty once instilled by ideology. Operationally, Spring Awakening had ended with fewer than 15% of its troops intact, incapable of influencing events beyond Austria. Comparisons to Waterloo's Old Guard underscore that even elite forces are not immune to the consequences of strategic and moral failure. The surrender to US forces foreshadowed the final reckoning of the Reich, setting the stage for a retrospective analysis of the offensive's design and catastrophic consequences in the next chapter. January 1946. Washington, D.C., U.S. Army Historical Division. Stacks of German war diaries and operational logs lay sprawled across the oak tables, each document meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced. Analysts of the historical study, number 20-261, sifted through Wehrmacht situation reports, Kampfgruppe communications, and 6th SS Panzer Army fuel requisition forms. Maps comparing planned advances versus actual movements displayed deviations of up to 35 kilometers, highlighting critical delays. British Ultra intercepts confirmed German intentions for Operation Spring Awakening, revealing that Hitler's staff overestimated fuel stocks by 42%. Terrain data for the Trans-Danubian Hills indicated gradients and river crossings that would reduce average Panzer speed to 6 km per hour, a fact largely ignored by German planning staff. Field notes recorded that vehicle attrition rates exceeded 20% before engaging Soviet defenses. Analysts traced decisions from the Wolfschanz directives to the fragmented front lines, showing systemic errors rather than random misfortune. Technical analysis of coordination breakdown reveals operational shortcomings. The 6th SS Panzer Army, spanning an 80-kilometer front from Sechsverheervar to Wiener Neustadt, suffered severe communication lag due to destroyed radio relays and insufficient signal troops. Panzer units were instructed to advance in simultaneous thrusts, yet delays in armored battalions created gaps up to 15 kilometers between Kampfgruppen. Fuel shortages compounded the issue of the 57 tanks assigned to the 1st SS Leibstandarte Brigade. 21 ran dry by March 24th. Soviet forces, notably the 3rd Ukrainian Front, exploited these gaps with mechanized reconnaissance, achieving operational tempo advantages the Germans could not counter. Practically, panzer coordination failed before combat even began. Comparisons with Soviet operational design emphasize contrasting approaches. German planning relied on rigid hierarchical directives, demanding adherence to timetables even when intelligence indicated impossibility. Soviet commanders employed decentralized control, allowing units to exploit local conditions and adjust offensively without awaiting high command approval. While German units stalled over rivers, hillocks, and mud-choked roads, Soviet armored formations advanced 28 kilometers per day, using forward supply caches. The consequence, German tactical inflexibility magnified logistical failures and morale collapse, whereas Soviet adaptability compensated for attritional losses. Analysts noted that doctrinal rigidity, rather than numerical inferiority, dictated the failure. Post-war field evidence reinforces systemic collapse. Reconnaissance photos from March 28 show burned-out Panther tanks along retreat routes at intervals averaging 400 meters, matching logistic logs detailing breakdowns and fuel depletion. Diaries of SS Sturmbannführer Wilhelm Rose confirm multiple aborted attacks due to missing infantry support. British ultra decrypts documented German intentions to capture Güncher by March 25, yet Soviet advance secured the city 3 days earlier, invalidating German schedules. Interrogations of surviving staff officers indicated that High Command failed to adjust attack vectors despite real-time front reports. Empirical evidence suggests failures were both predictable and preventable, emphasizing human and organizational error over enemy superiority alone. Broader implications extend beyond tactical defeat to strategic doctrine. Hitler's insistence on spring awakening represented ideological denial, manifested as operational order, ignoring terrain, supply, and manpower realities. The failure shattered remaining Wehrmacht cohesion in Hungary, leaving Vienna exposed and accelerating Reich disintegration. Comparisons with the Ardennes offensive show a repeating pattern of overestimation and scapegoating, confirming a chronic failure of strategic planning under Hitler's direct influence. Analysts conclude that Spring Awakening was not merely a mismanaged offensive, but a textbook case of operational hubris. The Army's material strength, including 300 operational tanks, became irrelevant when the staff's planning ignored practical constraints. Additional supporting evidence underscores intelligence failures and mismanagement. Soviet SIGINT, corroborated by captured German codes, enabled anticipation of advance routes, while German reconnaissance underperformed due to destroyed aerial assets and insufficient forward observers. Army Historical Study Nova 20-261 records that High Command ignored local engineering reports, highlighting weak bridges and impassable river crossings. Fuel logistics assumed an unrealistic throughput of 400 tons per day, yet actual delivery averaged only 175 tons. These discrepancies directly caused immobilization of 23 Panthers and 11 half-tracks by March 26. Analysts highlight that German planning repeatedly neglected cross-verification of technical data, exposing the offensive to predictable failure. Human and operational consequences were profound. Thousands of elite soldiers faced attrition before meaningful engagement. Morale collapsed and command authority eroded. Survivors described retreat as a forced march into chaos, with exhausted troops abandoning weapons, vehicles, and comrades. Civilian populations suffered collateral damage as units displaced or destroyed infrastructure in a futile attempt to slow Soviet pursuit. The combination of doctrinal rigidity, flawed logistics, and enemy intelligence supremacy ensured that even experienced officers could not maintain cohesion. By early April, the remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army had ceased to function as a coordinated force, foreshadowing the surrender to US forces in Austria. As analysts concluded their forensic reconstruction in 1946, the anatomy of Spring Awakening's disaster became clear. Failure was deliberate in design, rooted in misjudged resources, terrain, and command structure. Comparison with modern doctrinal studies highlighted that even technologically capable armies succumb when operational plans ignore intelligence and logistics. The frontline collapse demonstrated a chain reaction where tactical delays multiplied into strategic defeat, eroding both military capability and morale. This comprehensive review set the stage for examining Hitler's psychological deterioration in the next chapter, showing that strategic miscalculation and personal hubris are inseparable in determining the course of catastrophic campaigns. April 21st, 1945, Führerbunker, Berlin. The room stank of smoke and stale air, maps pinned to walls, trembling under flickering electric lamps, and Adolf Hitler paced in circles over the concrete floor, voice rising as he gestured toward dispatches from the collapsing Eastern Front. Heinrich Himmler's final reports had arrived late the previous night, detailing the remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army barely clinging to organization near Linz and St. Pölten. Hitler tore a map in half, muttering about faithless generals and cowardly soldiers, while Joseph Goebbels scribbled notes on morale reports, noting discrepancies between rhetoric and reality. Speer attempted to interject, explaining that fuel stocks in Hungary were exhausted to 38% of planned requirements, and that transportation bottlenecks delayed armored deployment by over 24 hours. Hitler waved him away, insisting that moral strength could overcome material weakness, repeating the claim in 3 separate speeches within 45 minutes. Eva Braun remained in the corner, documenting the tension in diaries, while Traudl Junge copied orders dictating phantom troop movements that never existed. The walls reverberated with fury, echoing the collapse of operational logic outside the bunker. Technical scrutiny of Hitler's directives reveals systemic impossibility. Orders sent to the 3rd Panzer Corps demanded advances of 15 kilometers per day across mud-choked roads averaging 20% gradient, yet available Panther tanks had a top practical speed of 6 kilometers per hour on the same terrain. Communications breakdown compounded delays. Of the 42 field radios assigned, 21 were destroyed or inoperable by April 22nd. Speer's post-war interrogations, documented in Nuremberg transcripts, confirmed that fuel allocation calculations assumed full rail access and intact bridges along the Danube, both of which were compromised. Infantry support for armored thrusts was depleted to 40% strength, leaving tanks vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank teams from the 3rd Ukrainian Front. Practically, even obedient units could not comply with Hitler's orders, rendering them operationally inert before engagement. Comparison with Soviet command highlights the contrast between ideology and pragmatism. Soviet generals, including Rodion Malinovsky of the 2nd Guards Army, employed flexible, decentralized command, allowing units to exploit weaknesses in German lines without waiting for approval. In contrast, Hitler's staff demanded obedience to abstract plans, emphasizing symbolic victory over realistic capability. When Soviet armor penetrated bridges thought secure, German units hesitated for hours awaiting revised orders, amplifying losses. This doctrinal rigidity, combined with an over-reliance on perceived moral superiority, demonstrated that belief in ideology could not substitute for situational awareness and intelligence. The human cost was immediate: disorganized withdrawals, abandoned equipment, and exhausted troops facing relentless pursuit. Field evidence from April 24th through 29th corroborates systemic collapse. Observers documented 34 destroyed Panther tanks along the Vienna-Linz corridor, including vehicles immobilized due to fuel depletion or broken axles. Goebbels' diary recorded that over 2,000 civilians were executed under orders, citing defeatism, a reflection of ideological extremism overshadowing operational necessity. Traudl Junge's notes describe Hitler issuing new orders for phantom armies, demanding simultaneous defense of Vienna, Linz, and Graz, with units that no longer existed. Soviet after-action reports confirm that German resistance was scattered, with pockets of organized defense limited to less than 15% of initial force strength. The evidence paints a clear picture. Operational reality had vanished, leaving only the illusion of command. Broader implications of these directives reveal psychological and organizational dysfunction. Hitler's insistence on moral will over material conditions illustrates a delusional leadership model where ideology dictates orders irrespective of human and logistic feasibility. Comparison with historical collapses such as the fall of Napoleon's Old Guard at Waterloo shows that even elite formations cannot sustain performance when high command ignores reality. Units previously considered fanatical and disciplined now retreated in disarray, abandoning weapons, vehicles, and doctrine. Analysts post-1946 highlighted that Spring Awakening's remnants, reduced to fewer than 15% operational capacity, exemplified how ideological rigidity transforms defeat into catastrophe. Morale disintegrated as soldiers realized that loyalty to delusion was lethal. Additional evidence underscores the lethal interplay of belief and command. Speter documented that Hitler refused repeated requests to evacuate essential material, insisting that factories and munitions be destroyed only after final victory, resulting in an accelerated loss of industrial capacity. Communications logs indicate that requests for reinforcements from the 6th SS Panzer Army went unanswered for 48 hours. Goebbels observed that Hitler's speeches delivered to staff and propagandists increasingly diverged from reports of collapsing front lines, creating cognitive dissonance among officers. This deliberate disregard for situational awareness exacerbated casualties, leaving fragmented units exposed to both Soviet and American forces. Comparative study with Allied command systems shows that recognition of logistical and operational limitations is crucial to minimizing losses. Human and operational consequences reached their apex in the final days of April. Troops under fragmented command either surrendered to advancing US forces or were annihilated by the Red Army in rearguard actions, with post-war reports documenting executions for war crimes. Hitler's inner circle faced moral and existential dilemmas, observing the Führer's detachment from reality while trying to maintain operational coherence. The psychological collapse of command eroded discipline, with soldiers abandoning formations and civilians fleeing the capital in terror. By April 30th, Hitler's suicide in the bunker ended not only his personal life, but symbolically terminated the delusion that ideology alone could dictate reality. The parallel with Samson, destroying himself along with the temple, resonated in the complete collapse of strategic control. As the bunker fell silent, historians analyzing the period in 1946 concluded that Spring Awakening and the final days of Hitler's command exemplified the danger of substituting belief for material reality. Strategic plans based solely on ideological conviction led to predictable operational failure, cascading into human catastrophe. Comparison with modern doctrinal studies emphasizes the necessity of feedback loops, situational flexibility, and realistic assessment of resources. The delusion of will had destroyed both Germany's military capacity and any remaining hope of stabilizing the front, setting the stage for the Soviet memory and perspective examined in the following chapter. Ideology had failed spectacularly, leaving only ruin. March 21st, 1945, near Lake Balaton, Western Hungary, Soviet correspondent Ivan Petrov peered through binoculars as the first smoke plumes from German Panther tanks, rising along the 25-kilometer front, signaled the start of the Balaton defensive operation. Petrov scribbled notes on the tactical dispositions of the 6th SS Panzer Army remnants, while Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin's headquarters transmitted orders to the 2nd Guards Army and 6th Guards Tank Army for immediate countermaneuvers. German armored thrusts had initially penetrated 5 kilometers into Soviet lines, but logistical delays and underestimation of terrain constraints slowed their advance to just 2 kilometers per day. Field reports indicated that over 100 heavy artillery pieces were positioned along the ridge lines east of Siofok, effectively creating interlocking zones of fire. Soviet observers recorded German radio traffic intercepted by their intelligence units, confirming unit disorganization across the 80-kilometer front. Local villagers fled, and columns of refugees clogged secondary roads, complicating both sides' operations. This operation, later formally designated the Balaton Defensive Operation in Soviet archives, represented not merely a tactical engagement, but a test of endurance against elite German formations. Technical assessment of the battle reveals the depth of Soviet preparation. Soviet artillery units, including 72 152mm howitzers and 84 122mm cannons, were pre-registered with precise firing data across the anticipated attack corridors. Tank formations, including 184 T-34 85S of the 6th Guards Tank Army, had refueling points every 12 kilometers, maintaining operational readiness above 90%. In comparison, German Panzer divisions operated at 32% fuel availability, with an average mechanical failure rate of 21% per unit, as documented in captured operational logs. British Ultra Intercepts had previously confirmed German intentions to concentrate armor near Sárvíz, but Soviet command had already fortified positions, turning enemy intelligence into a liability. Excerpts from Marshal Tolbukin's memoirs highlight the anticipation of both enemy intent and terrain-induced delays, allowing counterattacks to be launched without overextending Soviet lines. Comparative analysis of Soviet and German operational doctrine emphasizes the decisive advantage of flexibility. German planning relied on rigid adherence to preset objectives, assuming synchronized advances across the front, yet terrain and fuel shortages disrupted cohesion. Soviet command, by contrast, delegated initiative to regimental commanders, allowing adaptive responses to breakthroughs. When German tanks became immobilized near Balaton Führerbunker, Soviet infantry and anti-tank teams exploited exposed flanks within 24 hours, forcing retreats without significant strategic risk. This doctrinal contrast underlined a core lesson: centralized ideology-driven command cannot substitute for decentralized operational control and situational awareness. The outcome illustrated that elite units alone cannot compensate for logistical and organizational rigidity. Field evidence from the operation confirms these theoretical advantages. Soviet reports documented 45,000 German soldiers and 500 tanks neutralized or destroyed between March 21st and April 2nd, including 23 Panthers immobilized in marshy terrain along the Zala River. Soviet casualties, recorded at roughly 80,000, reflected intense combat, particularly in urbanized villages along the front. Veteran accounts collected decades later describe constant artillery barrages, minefield navigation, and the clearing of fortified positions under heavy fire. Correspondents noted that German command often failed to respond coherently, with units advancing without reconnaissance, repeatedly colliding with prepared Soviet defenses. The operational reality confirmed that planning and foresight, coupled with adaptive leadership, determined survival and effectiveness on the battlefield. Broader implications of the Balaton defensive operation extended beyond immediate military victory. Soviet historiography likened it to the Battle of Kursk, emphasizing defensive mastery over material and numerical advantage. Tolbukin's writings stress that endurance, preparation, and foresight created both symbolic and practical legitimacy for Soviet forces, reinforcing the narrative of the Red Army as a disciplined and invincible force. Observers noted that German failures reflected cumulative logistical mismanagement, poor terrain assessment, and overestimation of remaining combat strength. The operation's success solidified the Red Army's reputation in Hungary and across Eastern Europe as capable of withstanding and then reversing even elite German offensives. Additional evidence emerges from memorialization and archival records. Soviet memorials erected near Siorfok and Gunyor commemorate both units and individual soldiers, detailing precise casualty figures, unit identifications, and armored losses. Army Historical Study, number 2261, cross-examined these numbers with German war diaries, confirming the destruction of approximately 500 German armored vehicles and the retreat of remaining forces across the Danube. Comparative study with Kursk illustrates that both battles defined the Soviet approach to operational depth, positioning reserves effectively and preemptively countering German thrusts. Civilian testimonies recorded in Hungarian city archives indicate widespread displacement, but minimal interference with Soviet operational effectiveness. Human and operational consequences were substantial. Soviet casualties approached 80,000, including over 20,000 infantry losses, and 42 T-34s disabled. Yet the cost-secured territory neutralized elite German formations and enabled uninterrupted advance toward Vienna. Veterans interviewed in the 1970s recalled days of continuous engagement, exposure to artillery and panzer fire, and reliance on camaraderie to endure logistical scarcity. German survivors documented post-war described disorganization, demoralization, and fear of Soviet reprisal, emphasizing the contrast between disciplined Soviet adaptation and German rigidity. Victory was thus as much a psychological and organizational achievement as a physical one, confirming the effectiveness of strategic foresight combined with doctrinal flexibility. As Soviet flags were raised over liberated towns in Western Hungary, historians analyzing operational records concluded that Balaton represented both a tactical triumph and a symbolic vindication of endurance. Planning foresight, adaptable command, and rigorous logistical preparation allowed the Red Army to absorb elite German assaults and convert them into strategic advantage. The operation set the stage for subsequent advances into Austria, culminating in the capture of Vienna and the final collapse of German defensive capability. It also framed Soviet memory and historiography, emphasizing both human cost and disciplined execution as defining features of Red Army identity. The Red victory at Balaton thus became a prism through which post-war generations interpreted the final months of European conflict, blending triumph, loss, and historical narrative. April 22nd, 1945. Nagykanizsa, Western Hungary. Blackened rooftops and skeletal chimneys marked the remnants of a once thriving oil town, reduced to rubble by retreating German engineers and relentless Soviet artillery. Hungarian families trudged along cratered roads, carrying meager possessions as columns of Soviet T-34-85 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers swept through the surrounding villages. Field reports noted that over 400,000 Hungarians had been displaced, many crammed into temporary shelters in Szombathely and Veszprém counties. Local memoirs, later compiled in The Spring That Never Came, described children scavenging for food amid broken telegraph poles and twisted rail lines. Nagykanizsa's oil infrastructure, vital for Germany's waning war effort, had been systematically destroyed, with storage tanks totaling 35,000 cubic meters deliberately ruptured. Soviet engineers documented their capture of the remaining wells, immediately securing pipelines and refineries under the Red Army's operational control. Roads, once lined with orchards and vineyards, became graveyards for Panther tanks and abandoned trucks. The human toll of this bridge of blood was etched into every overturned cart and shattered window pane. Technical analysis of Hungary's devastation highlights the interplay of military strategy and resource denial. German demolition teams employed timed explosive charges on pipelines and pumping stations, designed to deliver 30 to 40 tons of structural damage per facility. Soviet engineering units in turn conducted rapid assessments of structural integrity, noting that nearly 70% of pre-war oil storage capacity was irrecoverable without months of repair. Rail lines, originally laid for a maximum axle load of 22 tons, were twisted by repeated shelling, effectively paralyzing supply distribution for both sides. Comparative study of German and Soviet engineering approaches reveals Soviet units prioritized immediate operational use and rapid repair, whereas German demolition focused solely on denial and obstruction. The practical consequence was a collapsed logistical backbone for both armies, but an immediate advantage for the Red Army's advance toward Vienna. Comparative perspectives between the Soviet occupiers and the Hungarian military illuminate the nation's strategic isolation. Hungarian divisions numbering 23,000 in the western provinces found themselves abandoned by retreating German formations, receiving neither artillery support nor fuel resupply. Soviet formations, in contrast, maintained robust supply lines with a calculated balance of armored mobility and field artillery coverage. Field reports from the 6th Guards Tank Army indicate that German positions were often overrun with minimal resistance, highlighting the disparity between Soviet cohesion and Hungarian vulnerability. The psychological consequence of this comparative breakdown left Hungarian soldiers questioning loyalty, duty, and survival, undermining morale even before formal occupation. Evidence from village surveys and Soviet after-action reports confirms widespread material destruction and civilian suffering. Over 37 villages along Lake Balaton were reduced to rubble, with 72 kilometers of primary roadways cratered or mined. Local hospitals reported treating more than 12,000 civilians for injuries related to shelling, burns, and collapsed structures, while food supplies dwindled to two-thirds of pre-war levels. Memoirs from displaced families recount fleeing columns of refugees stretching for 10 kilometers, often forced to forage along the roadsides for bread and water. Soviet reports confirm capture of 50 German armored vehicles, further diminishing any hope of local defense. The operational reality underscored the extreme human cost of balancing offensive momentum with the chaos of retreating armies. Broader implications of Hungary's crossfire reveal long-term social and economic consequences. With German forces obliterated and Soviet troops establishing authority, Hungary entered a period of occupation that controlled not only territory but energy resources, particularly the remaining oil fields in Nagy-Kanisa and Zala. This strategic appropriation shaped post-war political leverage and forced Hungary into a reconstruction paradigm dictated by external powers. Memoirs reflect a pervasive sense of betrayal, with citizens observing both empires collapse over their homeland. The narrative of Hungary as Eastern Europe's bridge of blood emerges, emphasizing national trauma in a theater dominated by foreign objectives rather than local agency. Additional evidence from post-war archives demonstrates how the operation's material and symbolic devastation influenced Hungarian national memory. Soviet engineers and Hungarian civil authorities collaborated to map remaining infrastructure, noting that only 28% of industrial capacity could resume immediate post-war operation. Comparative analysis with Austria and Czechoslovakia indicates Hungary suffered the highest ratio of urban destruction to pre-war population in Central Europe. Memoirs and oral histories consistently describe the disorientation of returning civilians, the absence of governance, and the imposition of Soviet authority over essential services. The technical destruction and operational occupation combined to enforce both physical and psychological dominance over the local population. The human and operational consequences were deeply intertwined. Displacement of 400,000 Hungarians created persistent refugee crises, while approximately 12,000 soldiers faced immediate surrender or internment, often under dire conditions. The destruction of transportation networks, oil infrastructure, and residential centers hampered both emergency relief and military stabilization. Survivor accounts describe reliance on improvised supply chains, barter, and collective shelters, highlighting both resilience and despair. The trauma extended beyond the battlefield, shaping a generation's memory and affecting political, cultural, and economic development for decades. The crossfire was not merely military, but existential. As Soviet flags rose over Lake Balaton towns and Hungary's western provinces, historians recognized the operation's dual legacy: a military victory for the Red Army and a national tragedy for Hungary. Infrastructure decimated, soldiers abandoned, and civilians uprooted, the nation became a living monument to the final clashes of two collapsing empires. Post-war reconstruction required navigating occupation authority, rebuilding essential services, and reconciling national identity with the overwhelming presence of foreign power. The stage was set for subsequent global reinterpretations of the offensive and Hungary's role in the closing months of the European conflict. The shadow of Spring Awakening lingered, a stark reminder that strategic decisions by external powers often exact the greatest toll on those caught in the middle. Spring 1972. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. A seminar table was strewn with color-coded maps of Western Hungary, annotated German unit dispositions, and translated Soviet operational summaries. Military theorists debated the logic behind Operation Spring Awakening, tracing the collapse of the 6th SS Panzer Army from the Balaton lakeshore to the outskirts of Vienna. Archival documents from the U.S. Army Historical Study number 2090-261 lay open, revealing precise German fuel allocations that averaged only 42% of planned requirements over the offensive's 2-week window. Comparative charts displayed Soviet troop density, which exceeded German formations by nearly 20% in both infantry and armored units. Discussions referenced armored vehicle readiness, noting that Panther OS-G tanks averaged operational status in only 37% of the units due to mechanical attrition. Doctrinal takeaway was stark: offensive warfare without logistics was inherently doomed. Seminar participants highlighted first-hand excerpts from Soviet-German post-war research collaborations, which underscored coordination failures across an 80-kilometer front. Technical examination of German command errors revealed cascading systemic failures. Panzer Army coordination broke down due to misaligned radio frequencies, resulting in delayed requests for fuel trucks capable of delivering 35 tons per convoy. Forward supply depots, intended to hold 100,000 liters of fuel and 600 tons of ammunition, were either captured or destroyed before use. Field reports indicated that units attempting a nighttime advance averaged only 3 kilometers per day, half the planned rate of 6 kilometers, due to impassable cratered roads and residual minefields. In contrast, Soviet logistics emphasized redundancy, with mobile fuel pipelines and field repair workshops attached to the Third Ukrainian Front. Practical consequences were immediate stalled offensives, overexposed armor, and increasing vulnerability to concentrated artillery barrages. Comparative analysis between German doctrine and modern Cold War-era military thinking illustrated the perils of ideology over operational reality. While German staff officers adhered rigidly to Hitler's belief in moral strength over material weakness, Western analysts highlighted the necessity of aligning force ratios, terrain assessment, and fuel projections. Panther tank units were weighed down by 35-ton ammunition loads and high-maintenance Maybach engines, contrasting with Soviet T-34-85s, simpler power plants, and field serviceability. Doctrine versus reality became painfully clear. The Germans gambled on faith in aggressive spirit rather than measurable logistics, while the Soviets integrated flexible supply networks into tactical planning. The human dimension reflected confusion at the lower command levels, where junior officers improvised under orders that ignored fuel, ammunition, and terrain constraints. Evidence from field tests and post-war interviews confirmed the operational collapse. Former SS tank commanders reported averaging less than 70 kilometers of advance during the entire offensive, with over 50 armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Soviet artillery regiments, positioned with inter-battery spacing of 2 kilometers, exploited German bottlenecks, inflicting losses of 400 personnel and 50 vehicles in a single engagement near Sárvíz. Archival photographs show Panther OSV gas holes scorched by 88mm shells, while accompanying Tiger IS experienced engine failure rates approaching 22%. Logistical miscalculations created predictable vulnerabilities. Units often halted at water crossings, unable to traverse muddy terrain due to insufficient fuel for self-recovery equipment. Soviet reports cited an operational success rate of 84% for counteroffensive maneuvers, demonstrating the efficacy of integrated planning. Broader implications of Spring Awakening's failure extended beyond immediate tactical outcomes. Scholars interpreted the offensive as a symbolic echo of Operation Barbarossa, an ambitious ideologically driven initiative undermined by inadequate preparation and systemic overreach. Lessons drawn for modern military strategy emphasized that numerical superiority and equipment sophistication alone could not compensate for operational blindness. Western analyses from Fort Leavenworth noted that failure to secure continuous supply lines or account for enemy intelligence left the German High Command exposed to both strategic and psychological collapse. The battle became a case study in how leadership denial and rigid doctrine amplify human and material losses. Further evidence from Cold War-era archives reinforced the narrative of systemic futility. Interviews with descendants of German veterans revealed that unit diaries were meticulously kept, yet almost all acknowledged fuel shortages, disrupted communications, and battlefield confusion. Soviet archives, opened in the 1970s, included captured German radio logs and supply manifests, confirming breakdowns in coordination across Panzer divisions. Comparative analysis with NATO operational planning in the 1960s highlighted stark contrasts. Western doctrines insisted on mobile logistics, flexible front assignments, and contingency fuel depots, while German planners had assumed linear progress without accounting for enemy countermeasures. The result was an instructive juxtaposition. Strategy imposed on ideology invariably falters. Human and operational consequences were profound and enduring. Approximately 80,000 Soviet casualties and 45,000 German losses including 500 armored vehicles, underscored the brutal arithmetic of misapplied doctrine. Units immobilized by mechanical failure, soldiers trapped by destroyed infrastructure, and officers bound to impractical orders exemplified the lethal cost of ignoring logistical realities. Post-war analyses emphasized that even tactical victories could not mitigate the strategic failure imposed by ideological rigidity. Memoirs and oral histories from both sides consistently describe a mixture of exhaustion, disillusionment, and posthumous questioning of leadership wisdom. The battle left psychological scars that persisted in families, communities, and military education curricula. By spring 1984, at seminars in London, West Point, and Moscow, Spring Awakening was universally referenced as the final folly, a mirror reflecting the consequences of human blindness to operational reality. Historians and theorists concluded that no ideology, however compelling, could substitute for precise planning, adaptable logistics, or recognition of enemy capabilities. The archival research, comparative studies, and descendants' testimonies collectively framed the offensive as a cautionary tale for future generations. Lessons extended beyond World War II, informing doctrines from mechanized warfare to Cold War contingency planning. The stage was now set for the documentary's final chapter, where poetic closure would reconcile the human, operational, and symbolic dimensions of Europe's last great offensive. Spring 2025, Lake Balaton, western Hungary. Sunlight glinted off the rippling water, where rusted Panther os. Gear hulls lay half submerged at coordinates 47 degrees 0 minutes north, 17 degrees 25 minutes east. Drone footage hovered over vineyards that now cover former German and Soviet assembly points, tracing the geometric outlines of tank tracks still visible beneath the fertile soil. Archival black and white photos from April 1945 dissolved into color imagery of rolling green hills, a juxtaposition of devastation and renewal. Local farmers, during early March plowing, still unearthed artillery shells from the 88mm caliber variety, cataloguing them before safe disposal. Memorial plaques near the Sárvíz Canal commemorate the units lost during the Balaton defensive operation, recording 79,000 Soviet casualties and 45,000 German losses, numbers echoing through time. The water's edge bore fragments of Tiger turrets, their serial numbers faintly etched in corroded steel. Above, the Hungarian poem Távez Ébredés drifted across the lake, voiceover tracing Spring's awakening over battle-scarred fields. The silence was absolute, yet layered with centuries of history. Technical inspection of submerged armored remains revealed extensive corrosion patterns and war damage consistent with post-capture abandonment. Panther hulls, weighing 44 tons each, with Maybach HL 230 engines rated at 700 horsepower, had lost structural integrity in approximately 80 years of exposure to freshwater and silt. Analysis of Tiger II remnants showed twisted armor plates measuring 100 mm in thickness, confirming battlefield accounts of Soviet 85 mm and 122 mm artillery penetration. The density of ordnance across fields suggested concentrated artillery barrages in 5 primary zones, each averaging 30 hectares, corroborated by contemporary Soviet after-action reports. Comparisons with T-34-85 survivability indicated that lighter Soviet armor often fared better against long-range artillery, highlighting differences in mobility, maintenance, and logistical deployment. Field archaeologists noted shell craters averaging 2 meters in diameter, spaced irregularly due to German misaligned fire coordination. These physical remnants underscored operational consequences of decisions made under duress in April 1945. The landscape, though calm, preserved a precise technical record of failure and endurance. A comparative view revealed contrasts between German and Soviet systems of war and remembrance. German armored units relied on 35-ton vehicles with high-maintenance engines, while Soviet formations used lighter, mechanically simpler T-34 SES and self-propelled artillery capable of sustained firing over longer operational periods. Modern drone surveys mapped former supply routes, showing where German fuel trucks stalled or bogged down, versus Soviet logistical corridors that facilitated continuous resupply. Memorialization reflected these differences. German cemeteries often concentrated in singular mausoleums, whereas Soviet monuments spread across multiple villages, emphasizing collective resilience over individual heroism. Analysis of photographic archives illustrated an asymmetry of visibility. German strategic documentation focused on unit movements, whereas Soviet images captured both battlefield and civilian landscapes. This dual lens illuminated operational, technical, and cultural outcomes simultaneously. Human endurance was measured not only in survival but in memory preservation. The quiet fields narrated both perspectives. Field evidence confirmed both operational and human consequences. Local archaeologists documented over 400 spent shell casings and 95 fragmented anti-tank mines in a 1-kilometer stretch near Balaton Boglar. Soil testing revealed lead concentrations of 300 milligrams per kilogram in former firing zones, evidence of concentrated ordnance deposition. Farmer testimonies described tractors overturning on concealed craters, highlighting ongoing hazards decades later. GPS mapping correlated these hazards with archival Soviet reports, detailing defensive artillery emplacements, confirming historical accuracy of operational records. Underwater sonar scans revealed intact Panther turrets at depths of 2 meters, suggesting sudden abandonment rather than deliberate destruction. Comparative studies with Kursk battlefield remnants indicated similar preservation patterns, emphasizing that terrain and environment record military activity more reliably than narrative history alone. Broader implications of Balaton's landscape became evident through these combined analyses. The fields, while lush and productive, acted as repositories of endurance rather than triumph. Human conflict had been encoded into soil composition, topography, and water chemistry, creating an unintentional archive. Memorial plaques, GPS-tagged artillery remnants, and museum exhibits provided layered access points for historians, families, and local communities. Archival comparisons with Nuremberg interrogation transcripts of German officers demonstrated operational miscalculations now mirrored in physical terrain. Lessons extended beyond military science, reflecting how nature absorbs and transforms human conflict over decades. The region's identity as a bridge of blood in Eastern Europe was inseparable from its continuing agricultural vitality. Silent observation of these fields offered reflection on both strategy and survival. Additional evidence highlighted cultural and commemorative dimensions. Photographs from the 1970s of the first memorials near Sárvíz Canal showed steel plaques mounted on concrete pedestals, juxtaposed against modern drone panoramas of the same sites. Hungarian memoirs, including excerpts from The Spring That Never Came, recounted civilian displacement of 400,000 residents and the destruction of Nagakanisa oil infrastructure, illustrating both human and industrial consequences. Archival Soviet publications referenced the Balaton defensive operation as a defining example of Red Army resilience, echoing wartime doctrine. The layered memory embedded in the land, Poems, plaques, photographs, and physical remnants demonstrated continuity of narrative even as material decay progressed. Comparative analysis with other European battlefields indicated similar patterns of environmental memory where peace masks a landscape dense with historical testimony. These findings affirmed the persistence of wartime experience in both physical and cultural dimensions. Human and operational consequences remained tangible. Farmers continued to discover unexploded ordnance each spring, necessitating yearly interventions from Hungarian bomb disposal units. Vineyards overlay former assembly areas, their rows inadvertently preserving track patterns from Panther and Tiger units. Memorial ceremonies drew descendants of both German and Soviet veterans, uniting communities in recognition of endurance rather than triumph. Statistical overlays showed that less than 15% of original German Panzer divisions had survived the offensive, a stark contrast with 40% survivability in Soviet armored formations across the same terrain. These ongoing interactions between landscape, memory, and hazard reinforced the enduring human cost. Reflection on these patterns suggested that historical experience persists in daily life, even when abstracted into agriculture and commemoration. The quiet sky bore witness to both human and operational persistence. Spring 2025, Lake Balaton. The drone ascended, capturing the expanse of green fields, calm waters, and scattered memorials, while the voiceover recited lines from Tavas Ebrides, tracing a century's arc of conflict and recovery. Archival images of April 1945 faded into modern landscapes, revealing continuity between destruction and renewal. GPS coordinates marked sites where tanks, artillery, and soldiers had once defined the terrain, now overlaid by vineyards and pastures. The fields held no allegiance to victory or defeat. They preserved endurance, patterns of human choice, and traces of ideological collapse. Historians, veterans' families, and local residents alike observed that while time erases noise, it does not erase witness. Beneath the quiet sky, the war ended, but the silence still remembers. The chapter closed, leaving viewers with a sense of reflective continuity as the documentary returned full circle to the eternal landscape of Western Hungary.